Hi everyone, I am Dream Into Wealth. I know people watching this are trying to fall asleep. How are you? And I hope you are okay in life. Listen to my story and make yourself comfortable. Also, if y'all like this kind of stories, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. The tale of Dusty Merriweather and the bank of Hollow Creek. Dusty Merriweather weren't a man folks noticed at first glance. He didn't wear fine boots, nor flash a silver belt buckle. He carried himself like the prairie wind there, constant yet seldom seen. What set him apart weren't riches nor reputation, but the way he listened. While other men hollered for whiskey at the saloon, Dusty sat quiet in the corner, hearing the talk of drifters, ranchers, and shopkeepers. He had the kind of patience you could mistake for laziness till you noticed his eyes sharp as a hawk circling the canyon. In those days, Hollow Creek was no more than a speck on the trail, a cluster of clapboard buildings clinging to the muddy bend of a river that dried up half the year. Most folks came looking for silver veins in the ridges or quick fortune in cattle drives, only to leave broke, bitter, or buried. But Dusty weren't hunting silver nor chasing cows. He studied men's habits, watched how coin passed hand to hand, how debts grew like weeds in untended soil. He noticed something simple yet powerful. Money didn't just change hands, it lingered. See, miners struck rich one week, drank it gone the next, and soon owed more than they owned. Merchants gave credit they couldn't cover. Praying miners hit another vein. Ranchers sold herds, then begged for supplies till the next season. The whole town spun in circles. Fortunes made in a flash and lost twice as fast. But Dusty, he never chased storms. He saved. A nickel here, a dime there. He lent careful, not quick. And more than that, he kept records in a little oilskin book, writing by lantern light long after the town slept. The saloon keep, Hank Barlow, once asked him, "What the use of scratching numbers when the world blows round like tumbleweed?" Dusty just smiled, tapped the cover, and said, "Hank, storms pass, but a man who keeps track of what don't blow away always finds himself standing when the dust clears." By the time Hollow Creek suffered its worst drought, Dusty oilskin ledger was thicker than a preacher Bible. Crops withered, silver veins ran dry, cattle dropped dead in the fields. Families faced ruin. Men who'd swaggered through town a season before now came hat in hand, begging for loans to keep their roofs from collapsing. Banks in the city had already closed their ledgers, refusing to lend a penny to a town they called dead weight. Dusty opened his door. He didn't hand out coin careless. He asked questions, studied folks' character the way a rancher studies stock. A farmer who'd always worked hard but fell to drought got a loan, fair and modest. A drifter with whiskey on his breath got turned away. Dusty word spread. He weren't no charity, but he weren't no vulture either. He charged interest, sure, but he gave time enough for folks to breathe, rebuild, and pay back steady. That winter, while other towns shriveled into ghost camps, Hollow Creek held. Crops planted with Dusty loans sprouted in spring. Merchants reopened shelves, ranchers mended fences, and every coin returned to Dusty ledger built something greater than fortune, trust. Folks started calling his shack the bank, though it was nothing but a desk, a safe, and a man with a steady hand. He expanded quiet, without fanfare, took on a helper to tally accounts, bought a real safe bigger than a whiskey barrel, painted Merriweather & Co. on the door, though most still called it Dusty Bank. And while boom towns all around rose fast and died faster, Hollow Creek grew solid. Not rich, not grand, but steady. Families stayed, schools opened, roads got laid straight, and at the heart of it all was Dusty little oilskin book, grown into a library of ledgers stacked high. Some called him lucky, others called him shrewd. Dusty just shrugged and said, "Ain't luck, ain't genius, it just listening longer than most and keeping steady when others run blind." By the time his beard turned silver, Dusty Merriweather had done more than save a town. He'd built an empire of patience. And Hollow Creek, once a forgotten bend in a dry river, had turned into the crossroad of a county, known not for silver nor cattle, but for the one thing rarer than both, a man who made fortune slow, steady, and honest. And on nights when rain pattered on tin roofs, old-timers swore they could still hear his voice echo through the dark. Don't chase the storm, boys. Plant yourself like a river and let fortune come find you. Dusty Merriweather Little Bank grew in ways even he hadn't fully planned. By the time Hollow Creek steadied itself after that cruel drought, wagons rolled in from outlying settlements just to see him. They weren't drawn by marble columns or gold-trimmed doors, for there were none. They came because word had spread across the plains. Dusty lent fare, kept honest books, and didn't break when storms howled. Families who had near lost everything found themselves standing again because a quiet man with ink-stained fingers gave them time to breathe. That kind of reputation traveled farther than any poster nailed to a wall. It didn't take long for outsiders to catch wind of it. Sharp-dressed men rode in from the city, boots polished, hats tipped too low. They spoke in tones like silver smooth, glittering, and false if you listened close enough. They saw Hollow Creek standing while other towns withered, and they wanted their peace. One such man, calling himself Mr. Reddick, strutted into Dusty's office with a smile like a knife. "Merriweather," he said, spreading his arms wide, "you're sitting on a gold vein without even knowing it. Partner with me and we'll turn this shack into a bank, the likes of which the territory never seen. Railroads, warehouses, more loans than you could count. All you gotta do is let me grease the wheels." Dusty didn't blink. He leaned back slow, thumbing the corner of his ledger. "And when those wheels run too fast, Reddick, who left picking up the wreck?" Reddick laughed, loud and hollow, and strutted out, swearing Hollow Creek would regret refusing him. But Dusty just shook his head. He knew storms in suits when he saw them, yet the pressure grew. The more Hollow Creek thrived, the more outsiders circled like buzzards. Some tried to sweet-talk, some threatened. Even a few townsfolk began wondering if Dusty weren't too cautious. They'd tasted survival, but now they hungered for riches. "Why not lend more?" one merchant asked. "Why not borrow from the city banks and make Hollow Creek shine like Denver?" Dusty listened quiet, nodding at every word, then finally said, "Because fast shine fades. We ain't here to be a lantern burning bright for a night. We're here to be a fire that keeps through winter." It wasn't easy holding steady when the promise of gold glittered on every horizon. There were nights Dusty sat alone by lamplight studying his ledgers till the ink blurred. He could see what expansion might bring, bigger profits, more land, louder praise, but he also saw what it could cost. Broken families, debts folks could never pay. Hollow Creek turned into just another boom camp gone bust. The weight of that choice pressed on him heavier than any sack of coin. When the next test came, it weren't from outsiders but from within. A miner by the name of Caleb Ross, strong as an ox but reckless as a wildfire, struck a vein in the hills. He came storming into Dusty Bank with pockets jingling and eyes wide. "Lend me big Merriweather ain't," he hollered. "I'll hire 50 men, open 3 shafts, make this town richer than kings." His excitement spread like fever. Folks crowded into the bank, cheering Caleb on. Even Dusty assistant, young Tom, whispered, "Maybe we ought to, Mr. Merriweather. Maybe this is the chance." Dusty looked Caleb dead in the eye. He didn't see riches. He saw ruin. A man already spending tomorrow before today was over. He closed the ledger soft. "Caleb," he said, "calm as rain. You got gold now. You don't need more debt. Work your claim steady, save your earnings, and in time you'll have something real." Caleb cursed him for a coward, stormed out, and by season end, his shafts had collapsed. His men scattered, his fortune gone. Folks who'd cheered him shook their heads, realizing the truth too late. That winter, when food was scarce and hope scarcer, it was Dusty, careful loans that kept Hollow Creek alive again. Families who'd saved as he taught had grain in their cellars. Merchants who hadn't overreached had goods on their shelves. And while Caleb wandered broke into the wilderness, Dusty Bank stood stronger than ever. The outsiders came back, offering louder deals, but the townsfolk answered for him this time. "We don't need your storms," they said. "We got our river." And Dusty, sitting at his desk with his oilskin ledger thicker than ever, just smiled. He knew storms would always come. Men like Reddick, dreams like Caleb, but he also knew rivers outlast storms. All it took was patience, trust, and the courage to stand steady when others rushed blind. And so Hollow Creek grew, not by leaps nor explosions, but by roots digging deeper each season. Folks built houses meant to last, roads meant to hold, lives meant to steady the next generation. Dusty Merriweather had done something few men ever managed. He'd turned patience into fortune, and fortune into a town that could weather any storm. Dusty Merriweather hair had long turned silver, and the lines at the corners of his eyes ran deep as wagon ruts on an old trail. He spent less time riding out to meet borrowers, more time sitting in his chair by the bank window watching Hollow Creek bustle with a life it had never known in his youth. Children ran in the streets, merchants argued friendly over prices, wagons hauled goods in steady instead of trickling. The town had grown roots and it showed. Yet even as he watched it thrive, Dusty knew storms never truly end, they just changed their shape. The new storm wasn't drought, nor silver fever, nor fast-talking strangers. It was ambition, born right there in Hollow Creek. Young men and women, raised on dusty patience, had grown restless with it. They saw the town standing firm, and they hungered for more than safety. Why should we be content with enough? They whispered to each other in back rooms and porches. Why not reach higher? Why not make Hollow Creek a city that shines across the territory? Dusty heard the whispers, just as he'd always heard the murmurs of miners and merchants, and it troubled him. His young assistant Tom, now near a man grown, came to him one evening, fire in his eyes. "Mr. Merriweather," he said, slamming a paper on the desk, "I've drawn up plans. We could expand the bank tenfold, open branches in every settlement from here to the mountains. Folks already trust us. We could turn Hollow Creek into the heart of the whole frontier. We could be richer than Denver banks." Dusty picked up the paper, studied it in silence. The numbers glittered, no doubt. Tom had worked careful, writing every figure neat, every projection high. Dusty set it down slow, folded his hands over it, and looked at the boy he'd mentored. "Tom," he said, quiet, "a river don't rush to every valley it sees. It carves one bed, steady and deep. That's why it lasts. You spread too wide, you run shallow. Shallow rivers dry up quick." Tom flushed, jaw tight. "With respect, sir, maybe you're letting fear hold you back. Times are changing. If we don't grow fast, someone else will." Dusty sighed. Leaning back in his chair, he remembered Reddick's slick grin, Caleb's wild eyes. He'd seen storms dressed in many clothes. Now they wore the eager face of his own protege. "Fear don't keep me still, Tom," he said. "Memory does. I've seen what happens when men chase more than they can carry. I've buried enough dreams to know which ones rot before bloom." But Tom wasn't convinced, and Dusty knew words alone might not be enough this time. The very next season, a new test arrived. A settlement upriver, Pine Hollow, suffered a flood that washed away homes and barns. Their leaders rode into Hollow Creek, hat in hand, asking Dusty for a massive loan to rebuild at once. Tom's eyes lit up. "This is it," he said. "If we stake Pine Hollow, we'll bind them to us. Hollow Creek will be more than a town, will be a region." Dusty studied the men from Pine Hollow. Their clothes were torn, faces hollow with loss. He asked quiet questions, same as always. How had they prepared? Had they saved against hard times? Had they built with care? The answers cut him like knives. They'd borrowed deep before, spent fast, and trusted fortune would always hold. Now they wanted Hollow Creek to carry their debts as well as their ruins. Dusty shut his ledger. "I'm sorry," he said. "I can lend some, enough to help you eat and mend roofs for winter, but I won't carry a debt that big, not from men who've shown they don't respect what borrowed." The Pine Hollow leaders cursed him as a miser, riding off in anger. Tom stared in disbelief. "You could have owned the whole valley," he burst out. Dusty looked him in the eye. "And what good owning a valley of quicksand? You can build a palace on it, Tom, but it'll sink just the same." That winter, Pine Hollow collapsed under the weight of its debts. The flood only the first crack in a rotten wall. Families fled, some finding their way to Hollow Creek, seeking steadier ground. Tom said little after that, though the fire in him hadn't died. Dusty knew the boy still dreamed of rivers made into oceans overnight, but he also knew some lessons can't be taught with words, they gotta be lived. And so Dusty kept to his river, patient as ever, praying that when his own time came to rest, Hollow Creek would remember not the glitter of false fortune, but the deep, steady current that had carried it through every storm. Dusty Merriweather felt the weight of years settle heavier with each season. His steps slowed, his hand shook a little when he held the quill, but his mind stayed sharp as ever. He could still see the numbers in his oilskin ledgers like stars on a clear night, patterns, currents, truths that other men missed because they rushed too fast to notice. But he also knew the river he had carved with patience couldn't depend on him forever. One day the bank and the town would rest in the hands of others, and that thought worried him more than any drought or flood ever had. Tom had grown into a capable man, strong-willed and clever, but his hunger for growth hadn't eased. Dusty had come to see it plain. The boy wanted to prove himself not just as a keeper of steadiness, but as a builder of an empire. He talked of expansion often, speaking with that same restless fire Dusty had seen in too many men who chased quick fortunes. Dusty respected his drive but feared his impatience. One autumn evening, after the ledgers were balanced and the lamps burned low, Dusty called Tom into the back office. He laid the oldest ledger on the desk, the first oilskin book, worn near to rags. Its pages were filled with the shaky scrawl of a younger man, entries for nickels and dimes, loans so small they'd seem laughable now. Dusty pushed it across the desk. "This," he said, "is the root of every wall and roof in Hollow Creek. Not because it was big, but because it was honest. Every number here is a promise kept. When I'm gone, it won't be your ambition folks remember, it'll be whether you kept their trust." Tom nodded, but his eyes strayed to newer ledgers, thicker and bolder. Dusty saw it, sighed, and said no more. Some truths can't be hammered in, they've got to soak into the bones with time. Not long after, another storm arrived, not of weather, but of men. The railroad, stretching its iron tracks across the frontier, set its sights on Hollow Creek. A company agent strode in with contracts and maps, offering riches beyond measure if the town would mortgage itself to bring the rail line through. The council was split. Merchants salivated at the idea of more trade. Ranchers dreamed of bigger markets, and Tom argued harder than any of them. "This is the future," he said, eyes bright. "We can't stand in the way of it. With the railroad, Hollow Creek could be a city. Without it, we'll be left behind." All eyes turned to Dusty. For decades, he had been the town anchor, the voice they trusted when storms rose. But this storm was different. To refuse the railroad felt near unthinkable. To accept it meant betting everything on the very kind of speed and ambition Dusty had always warned against. He rose slow from his chair, his hands resting on the desk to steady his old bones. "The railroad is a river in its own right," he said. "Mighty, fast, and dangerous if you build too close to its flood. It can feed you or it can drown you. If Hollow Creek welcomes it, do so with care. Don't borrow more than you can pay. Don't build taller than your roots can hold. Remember, rivers cut deep, but floods vanish quick." The council sat in silence, torn between Dusty wisdom and Tom fire. In the end, they voted cautious. They welcomed the railroad, but on small terms, refusing to gamble the town whole fortune. The line came through, but Hollow Creek didn't swell into a glittering city like Tom dreamed. It grew steady, measured, keeping its feet on firm ground. Dusty watched with relief, though he saw Tom's disappointment plain. That night, sitting alone under the hiss of rain on the bank roof, Dusty whispered to himself, "Better a slow river than a flood that leaves you begging." Winter came hard that year. Dusty's health faltered. He spent more hours by the fire, less at the desk, yet townsfolk still came knocking, asking advice, thanking him for years of steady hands. Children waved when he walked slow down the street. Mothers told their sons, "Mind your coin like Mr. Merriweather." Fathers said, "Keep your promises like Dusty does." He'd become more than a banker. He'd become a creed, living flesh of the very patience he preached. As spring thawed the rivers and the cottonwoods budded green, Dusty knew his time was drawing short. He called Tom once more into the office, handing him the keys to the great safe. "The bank is yours," he said, "but remember, coin is only paper if it don't carry trust. Guard that harder than gold." Tom's eyes shone, half with pride, half with burden. Dusty leaned back, tired but calm, and added, "Storms will tempt you, boy. Don't chase 'em. Dig rivers." Not long after, Dusty Merriweather passed in his sleep, rain tapping soft against the window, as if the world itself were whispering him home. The town mourned, but they didn't break. His river had carved too deep a bed to be washed away in one season. The true storm lay ahead, whether Tom and the next generation would honor his creed or chase the flood he'd always warned against. Tom Merriweather, once the eager apprentice with ink stains on his cuffs, now stood where Dusty had sat for decades. The oilskin ledgers, worn and swollen with the weight of Hollow Creek history, were his to guard. The keys to the safe hung heavy in his pocket, and the gaze of the whole town seemed fixed upon him, expecting him to be what Dusty had been. But Tom felt the pull of two rivers within him, one slow and steady, carved by Dusty's hand, and another fast and thunderous, calling him toward ambition Dusty never embraced. At first, Tom walked the path his mentor had left. He leant cautious, asked questions, turned away slick men whose eyes gleamed too bright. Families nodded, merchants trusted him, and Hollow Creek rolled on as steady as always. Yet Tom could not shake the itch. He watched the railroad line hum with trains bringing riches to other towns, turning once-forgotten specks into booming centers of trade. He saw merchants pass through Hollow Creek, buying supplies but settling elsewhere, and he thought Dusty kept us alive. But I could make us more. So when a group of railroad men came one spring, laying out plans for a depot bigger than anything Hollow Creek had yet seen, Tom listened harder than Dusty ever would have. They promised jobs, trade, wealth that would flow like floodwater. All they asked was a loan large enough to build warehouses, lay track spurs, and line their pockets for good measure. The council hesitated, remembering Dusty warnings, but Tom argued fierce. "We've lived long enough by scraps and steadiness," he said, slamming his fist on the table. "Dusty gave us roots, yes, but roots don't matter if you never grow a trunk. We've the chance to be more than a river bend. We can be the crossroads of the whole frontier." Against their fears, Tom convinced them. Hollow Creek borrowed deep, and Meriwether Bank shouldered the weight. Construction began at once, trains whistled louder, and for a time the town glittered. Merchants thrived, inns overflowed, wagons stacked high with goods rolled down the streets. Tom walked with his chest high, hearing folks say his name the way they once said Dusty Bess. "Tom making Hollow Creek great," they whispered. But roots pulled shallow grow weak, and storms test all things. The first crack came with a dry season that shriveled crops and left shelves bare. Merchants leaned heavier on credit, sure the trains would bring prosperity again come fall. When the rains failed a second year, debts piled higher. Tom opened the safe more often, lending larger sums to keep folk afloat. Just a little longer, he told himself. Once the trains pick up, all will be well. It wasn't. The railroad company, bloated on loans, pulled its men to richer towns upriver. The depot stood half-finished, track rusting in the sun. Merchants who'd borrowed deep couldn't repay. Families who'd trusted Tom found their debts growing faster than their harvests. Hollow Creek, once steady as a river, now churned like a flood. One night, Tom sat alone in the bank, ledgers spread before him, candles burning low. He flipped through the old oilskin book Dusty had given him, seeing entries for pennies and nickels, loans so small they seemed laughable beside the towering debts he now held. He felt Dusty's voice in the silence, soft as rain on tin. Coin is only paper if it don't carry trust. Tom set the book down, burying his face in his hands. He'd wanted greatness, but he'd traded steadiness for speed, trust for glitter. By winter, Hollow Creek was split in two. Some families cursed Tom for letting them into ruin, demanding debts be forgiven. Others stood by him, saying he'd only tried to give them more than Dusty ever dared. The town council bickered louder than the saloon on a Saturday night. And through it all, Tom wrestled with the storm inside himself, whether to double down on ambition or to claw the town back to Dusty's slow, steady river. That spring, he made a choice. He gathered the townsfolk in the square, the same place where Dusty had once stood tall, and laid the ledgers bare. "I chased more than this town could carry," he confessed. "I thought greatness meant speed. I forgot what Dusty taught me, that storms fade but rivers endure. If we're to survive, we must dig our river deep again. It'll be slow, it'll be hard, but it's the only way forward." Some wept, some cursed, but all listened. And from that day on, Tom set about rebuilding the trust he had strained. Loans grew smaller, ledgers grew stricter, and the depot, half rotted, was torn down plank by plank. Hollow Creek shrank from its brief glitter, but it did not die. And Tom, humbled, began to understand that a man's fortune weren't measured in the noise of his name, but in the steadiness of the river he left behind. Tom Meriwether arose each dawn with a heaviness that wasn't in his bones alone, but in the eyes of every man and woman who passed him on Hollow Creek streets. The townsfolk still tipped their hats polite, but their gazes lingered longer, weighing him, judging him. He had promised M more than Dusty ever dared, and for a spell he delivered. Wagons crowded the square, trains whistled through, merchants jingled coin in their purses. But storms always show what root and what driftwood, and when the rains failed, it was clear Tom's promises had been more flood than river. He set about repairing what he could. One by one, he wrote out to families who owed more than they could pay. Instead of demanding coin they didn't have, he sat with them at kitchen tables asking what they could give: labor, grain, time. He wrote new agreements in his ledger, crossing out debts that would only break them, replacing them with promises they could keep. They weren't easy. Some cursed him outright, calling him the reason they'd fallen in the first place. Others wept in gratitude, holding his hand as if it were a rope thrown to a drowning man. The merchants were harder. Many had built tall on shallow soil, borrowing more than they could ever cover. Some shut their shops and left town, leaving doors swinging in the wind. Others begged for extensions Tom could not grant. He had to choose who could be saved and who had already sunk. Every mark of his pen felt like judgment carved in stone. Some nights he stared at the ink until his eyes burned, hearing Dusty's voice whispering steady in the silence. "Trust is worth more than gold, Tom. Guard it." The young folk of Hollow Creek were the most restless. They'd tasted the glitter of sudden boom, and they didn't care to go back to steady plodding. They gathered in the saloon, speaking bold about leaving for bigger towns upriver, where trains still whistled loud and promises still glittered. Tom listened to their talk, silent in the corner where Dusty once sat, hearing in their voices the same hunger that had burned in his own. He couldn't chain them to Hollow Creek, nor did he try. But he told any who would listen, a fast town shines bright, but steady ground will hold you when the storm comes. Some scoffed, some rolled their eyes, but a few heard him and stayed. The true test came in the form of a new storm, this one not of nature nor railroads, but of greed wearing a neighbor face. Caleb Rosskin had returned, men cut from the same reckless cloth. They strutted into town with coin borrowed from faraway financiers, boasting they would rebuild Pine Hollow where their uncle had failed. They tried to lure Hollow Creek folk to join them, promise of quick riches dangled like bait on a hook. And for a moment Tom feared history would repeat itself. But something remarkable happened. Families who'd nearly drowned in debt shook their heads. Merchants who had barely clawed free turned away. Even the restless young, remembering the bitter taste of collapse, muttered, "We've had our fill of storms." One by one, they refused the bait. Hollow Creek had learned through hardship and near ruin the value of Dusty Creed. Tom stood on the porch of the bank that spring, watching wagons roll by, smaller loads but steadier faces. The depot still stood half abandoned, a skeleton of ambition gone wrong, but the town itself was alive. Children played in the square, shopkeepers swept their stoops, and the air smelled of bread and horses and soil turned for planting. It wasn't glittering, but it was real. He opened the old oilskin ledger again, the one Dusty had pressed into his hands, its pages yellowed and fragile. He traced the lines of ink, whispering aloud the words his mentor had left him. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. For the first time since taking the keys, Tom felt the truth of it not as advice but as law, carved into the marrow of Hollow Creek itself. It struck him then that greatness didn't lie in glitter nor in growing faster than rivals. Greatness lay in endurance, families who could weather lean years, merchants who kept their word, a town that stood when others blew away. His legacy would not be the boom he once craved, but the patience he finally learned. And so Tom set his hand to the work Dusty had trusted him with. He closed the ledger soft, stepped out into the drizzle falling gentle on Main Street, and lifted his face to the rain. The town would never be Denver, it would never shine like a city of glass, but it would stand, crooked and stubborn, like a river bend that outlasts 1,000 storms, ChatGPT said. Tom knew course tested him daily, but it also began to plant seeds he hadn't expected. The town, though scarred, carried on with a quiet resilience that spread like roots under soil. Families who once whispered about leaving now started speaking of staying, not because Hollow Creek promised wealth, but because it promised steadiness. Shops no longer overflowed with glittering goods from far-off cities, but they kept shelves lined with flour, nails, cloth, things folk needed to live, not just to boast. There was a dignity in that simplicity, and slowly, Hollow Creek leaned into it. The children felt it most. They grew up watching their parents tuck coins into jars, not to gamble on a boom, but to prepare for lean seasons. In the schoolhouse, the teacher, Mrs. Pruitt, stern but kind, began teaching numbers with Dusty Creed tied to M. Always save half, children. The other half will keep your belly full, but the saved half will see you through storms. Little fingers scratched sums on slates, and though the lessons seemed small, Tom knew they were building something more important than coin. They were building habits. Merchants adjusted too. Old Mr. Garner, who had nearly lost his store when the depot scheme collapsed, reopened with a smaller stock but stricter books. He no longer handed out endless credit. Instead, he followed Tom's example, lending only when he knew a man could pay. He grumbled at first, saying business was slower, but after a year he admitted his shelves stayed stocked and his nights came easier without creditors knocking. Dusty was right, he muttered one evening as Tom passed by. Better a trickle you can drink from than a flood that drowns you. Tom himself became something different in the eyes of the town. He was no longer the brash young banker dreaming of Hollow Creek outshining cities. He was a man who had stumbled, nearly led the town to ruin, and then bent himself back to Dusty River. That humility, born of mistakes, earned him a respect no ambition ever could. Folks trusted him again, not because he promised greatness, but because he admitted his failings and chose patience over pride. The true mark of this change showed one autumn when another outsider arrived. A man named Silas Green came riding in with big talk about cattle syndicates, offering to buy out ranchers' herds for fat sums if they'd only sign his contracts. A decade earlier, Hollow Creek might have jumped at the chance, but this time the ranchers gathered in the bank looking to Tom. He listened careful, asked questions, then closed his ledger with a smile. "Silas," he said, "your words are rich, but your contracts are thin. We'll not stake our lives on promises written faster than they can be kept." The ranchers nodded, back straight, and sent Silas riding off without a single signature. Tom felt Dusty's spirit near that day, like rain whispering on the eaves. As the years turned, Hollow Creek grew, not with glitter, but with grit. A new blacksmith set up shop, working honest iron. A mill turned steady on the river, grinding grain for families who'd once gone hungry. Roads were mended not with fanfare, but with neighbors shouldering tools together. And through it all, the Meriwether Bank remained the heart, its ledgers neat, its doors open, its creed spoken in the quiet way folk lived their lives. Tom often sat by the window at dusk, watching the town move, hearing the soft patter of rain on the roof. He thought of Dusty then, not the man who taught him numbers, but the man who taught him patience. He whispered the old words, as much a prayer as a memory. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. And for the first time, Tom believed not only that he had learned them, but that he was teaching them in turn. Hollow Creek would never outshine Denver. It would never roar with trains or glitter with towers. But it would stand, season after season, a river town carved not by speed, but by endurance. And in that steadiness, Tom saw a different kind of greatness, the kind Dusty had known all along. Word of Hollow Creek's steadiness began to travel farther than Tom ever intended. Neighboring settlements, battered by failed mines and broken promises, sent their folk downriver to trade where shelves stayed stocked and credit didn't collapse overnight. At first it was just a trickle, families bringing wagons to buy flour and seed, but soon it grew into a steady stream. The name Meriwether, once whispered with doubt after Tom's reckless years, was again spoken with respect. Not for boom, not for grandeur, but for something rarer, reliability. Tom noticed it most in the faces of travelers. They'd arrive weary, eyes sharp with suspicion, like wolves ready to bite. But after a day or two in Hollow Creek, seeing honest scales, fair prices, and no man trying to trick them, the suspicion softened. More than once a stranger clasped Tom's hand and said, "Don't know how you've done it, but this town feels different. Feels like it remembers something the rest of the frontier forgot." Tom would smile faint, hearing Dusty whisper in the words. The Council of Hollow Creek, emboldened by this slow growth, pressed Tom again. "Shouldn't we expand now?" they asked. "Neighboring towns are coming to us. Why not build bigger depots, spread wider, lend more?" Tom felt the itch rise in him like it always had, but this time he pressed it down. "We expand only as fast as our roots allow," he said. "Better to turn some away than to stretch ourselves thin and lose what makes them come to us in the first place." It wasn't the answer some wanted, but it was the truth the town had learned through hard winters and near ruin. A season later, a drought struck one of those neighboring towns, Dry Creek. Their wells sank low, their merchants folded, and families faced the edge of hunger. Word spread quick that Hollow Creek still had grain and supplies. Wagon after wagon rolled in, desperate faces looking to buy. Tom stood in the doorway of the bank, weighing the need against his town reserves. He could have named a high price, drained desperate men for every coin they carried, but he didn't. He sold fair, and when the poorest had nothing to trade, he wrote careful loans in his ledger, small enough they could pay when rains returned. That act sealed Hollow Creek's reputation. Folks said Meriwether Bank wasn't just a place of coin, it was a place of survival. Dry Creek families repaid every loan, not just in coin but in loyalty. They spread the word farther still. If you want fast fortune, chase the cities. But if you want your children to eat come winter, trust Hollow Creek. Tom felt pride stir, but not the kind that came from boom or glitter. It was quieter, heavier, like sitting by a fire on a cold night knowing you've enough wood stacked to last. He'd stumbled once, near drowned his town in ambition, but now he saw what Dusty had meant. Greatness weren't about size or shine, it was about endurance, about standing steady while the world buckled around you. The young folks still dreamed of more, of course. They saw wagons from far places and longed to ride out themselves, to chase storms and make their mark. Some did, leaving with promises to return rich. Most didn't. Yet Hollow Creek held firm, a river town that outlived both the booms and the busts. Those who stayed built lives with depth rather than flash. They planted orchards instead of gambles, wrote ledgers with ink that dried slow instead of figures that vanished overnight. Tom often found himself walking the riverbank at dusk, hearing the steady rush of water. It reminded him of Dusty words, the ones carved deeper than any storm could scour. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. He whispered it to himself, not as a warning now, but as a truth he finally understood with his whole being. The river didn't roar, it didn't glitter, it just carved stone, year after year, until valleys were born. That was the kind of fortune Hollow Creek had found, and Tom vowed he'd guard it with every breath left in him. It wasn't long before Hollow Creek's quiet reputation began stirring the wrong kind of attention. Rival bankers, slicked with city polish and eyes glittering like rattlers in the dark, came riding in to see what gave this little river town such stubborn strength. They walked through the square, saw merchants selling steady, saw families building homes meant to last, saw wagons lined up not for spectacle but for survival. It baffled them. A town that had no mines, no massive herds, no booming depots, yet it prospered while camps all around dried to dust. One such banker, Mr. Langley, strutted into Merriweather Bank with a smile like a blade. He laid a fine leather case on Tom's desk, opening it to show contracts thick as a preacher's sermon. "Mr. Merriweather," he drawled, "you've done well here, but you're sitting on a powder keg and don't even know it. Partner with me and we'll turn Hollow Creek into a regional hub. Credit lines, big investments, expansion across 3 counties. Why, you could double your wealth in a year." Tom studied him in silence, thumb resting on the edge of his old oilskin ledger. He could almost hear Dusty chuckle in the back of his mind. "Mr. Langley," he said at last, "I don't need to double my wealth in a year. I need families to eat steady for 100. You see the keg, I see the river. And rivers don't explode, they endure." Langley sneered, snapped his case shut, and stormed out. But others came after, each with promises louder than the last. Some tried flattery, some threatened, some offered bribes. Tom turned each away, steady as stones. His resolve earned him enemies he'd never see, but it also deepened the trust of his town. Folks began to say, if Merriweather won't bend to city sharks, then neither will we. Still, ambition has a way of creeping in through cracks, and Tom knew Hollow Creek wasn't immune. A few younger merchants, restless as colts in spring, began lending on their own outside the bank guidance. They offered easy credit, quick deals, contracts drawn fast without thought for tomorrow. For a season it seemed they thrived, wagons stacked high, pockets jingling. But when the harvest failed short and debtors couldn't pay, their books turned sour overnight. Shops shuttered, signs faded, and folk whispered about ruin. Tom could have gloated, but he didn't. Instead, he bought their debts careful, one by one, giving families time to breathe while teaching them the lesson Dusty had once taught him. Fast rivers flood, slow rivers carve. The turning point came during the harshest winter Hollow Creek had seen in decades. Snow lay thick on roofs, wagons froze in their tracks, and supplies ran low. Families huddled by fires, praying their stores would last. Merchants begged Tom to release more loans, fearful of collapse. He opened the safe, but not wide. Instead, he rationed grain and coin with a strict hand, lending small amounts to many instead of riches to a few. A loaf stretched among 5 may not fill bellies, he said, but it keeps them all standing till spring. By the thaw, Hollow Creek had held, thin, weary, but alive. Neighboring towns had lost whole families to hunger, but Hollow Creek buried few. Folk wept in relief, realizing Tom's restraint had saved them from starving. The same young men who once cursed his caution now tipped their hats with newfound respect. They began to see what Dusty had seen, what Tom had nearly forgotten. Fortune wasn't the glitter of plenty, but the steadiness of survival. That spring, Tom stood in the square watching wagons from 3 counties roll into trade. The air smelled of thawed earth and fresh bread. Children laughed in the streets, merchants swept their stoops, and a hymn of hammers rang from new homes rising on the edge of town. Hollow Creek wasn't rich, wasn't grand, but it stood. And in a land littered with ghost camps and broken promises, that made it shine brighter than any boomtown. Tom closed his eyes, feeling the drizzle of a light rain. He whispered dusty words, the ones that had saved him from himself. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. And as he listened to the murmur of the creek nearby, he knew the river was still flowing, deep and sure, carrying Hollow Creek toward a future no storm could wash away. Families began drifting into Hollow Creek from farther reaches than anyone had expected. Some came from busted mining camps where silver veins had run dry overnight and left whole towns hollow as a church bell on Sunday. Others came from cattle trails, tired of riding endless herds for ranchers who paid in promises that never matched the weight of coin. They arrived lean, weary, and suspicious, carrying little more than wagons half broke and children hungry from the road. At first, Hollow Creek bristled. Townsfolk worried the newcomers would strain the stores or worse, bring with them the same reckless habits that had ruined their old homes. But Tom met every wagon himself, standing by the square, ledger tucked under his arm. He asked questions, listened close, and weighed character the way Dusty had taught him. Some families he turned away with a shake of the head, too reckless, too eager for fast fortunes. But many he welcomed, settling them on small plots or putting them to work with merchants who needed hands. We can't save everyone, he told the council, but we can steady those who will dig roots with us. Slowly, Hollow Creek grew, not like a wildfire, but like a tree adding rings each season. The town stretched with new cabins, a bigger schoolhouse, and fields that sprouted grain where brush once stood. The newcomers, taught by Tom's strict but fair hand, learned the ways of patience. Save half, work steady, pay what you owe. At first they grumbled, calling him stern, but when the next hard season came and their cellars held, they whispered thanks instead. It wasn't long before folks in other valleys began calling Hollow Creek the safe town. Not rich, not wild, not grand, but safe. Travelers spoke of it in saloons miles away, saying, if you're tired of storms, go there. Meriwether keeps it steady. That reputation was worth more than gold. It drew not gamblers or drifters, but families looking to build something that would last. Still, not all were content. Some of the younger folk, raised in the comfort Dusty and Tom had built, began itching for more. They hadn't known the hunger of drought or the fear of empty shelves. To them, Hollow Creek felt too slow, too plain. They saw wagons passing through from cities upriver, loaded with bright goods and tales of quick fortunes, and they longed to chase after. Tom didn't try to hold them back. Storms will teach what words can't, he said. And sure enough, most who left came back years later, older, poorer, and wiser, ready to settle into the slow rhythm they once scorned. One evening, as rain pattered soft on the roof of the bank, Tom opened the old oilskin ledger again. Its pages were fragile, nearly crumbling, but the numbers still told their story: nickels, dimes, loans given and repaid. He traced the ink with a fingertip, whispering Dusty, "You planted roots deeper than I ever knew. I nearly tore them out once, but they held, stronger than me." He closed the book and set it back in its place, knowing it wasn't the paper that mattered anymore. The creed had soaked into the soil of the town itself. The next spring, Hollow Creek celebrated its first true fair, not the wild, drunken kind other towns threw when mines struck rich, but a gathering of farmers, merchants, and families. Wagons circled the square, children ran with ribbons, fiddles played while folk danced under lantern light. In the center of it all stood Tom, gray now but steady, nodding as he watched the town alive with joy. No one shouted of fortunes, no one boasted of sudden wealth. They laughed, they ate, they traded fair. It was a festival not of boom, but of endurance. And as the night drew on, rain began to fall, gentle at first, then steady. Instead of scattering, the people turned their faces to the sky, letting it wash them clean. Voices rose in unison, speaking words some of the children barely understood but knew by heart. Fortune don't come from speed nor luck nor loud talk. It comes from patience, trust, and keeping your eyes open when others shut theirs. Tom closed his eyes, hearing not just the people, but the rain itself, carrying Dusty old whisper. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. He smiled, certain that Hollow Creek River now ran too deep for any storm to wash away. It wasn't long before Hollow Creek name traveled past the counties and into the mouths of men who made decisions for whole regions. Where once they laughed at the place as a dry bend with no silver and no cattle herds, they now whispered of it as a town that never failed, never starved, never folded. Farmers spoke of its fair grain prices, ranchers of its steady loans, merchants of its honest scales. Travelers, bone-weary from ghost towns scattered across the frontier, found themselves resting in Hollow Creek and lingering longer than they meant to. They told others, and the reputation spread wider still. It ain't rich, but it'll stand. If you want safety, if you want trust, go to Hollow Creek. With that reputation came visitors of another sort, leaders and dreamers. A mayor from a distant county rode in one summer, sitting across from Tom in the bank, hat in hand. "Mr. Meriwether," he said, "our town near broke. We chased every mine and every cattle boom till there's nothing left but debt. Your way different. I've come to ask, could you show us how to build like Hollow Creek?" Tom studied him quiet, weighing the sincerity in his eyes. He didn't give him coin, not yet, but he shared what Dusty once gave him, the creed of patience. "Start small," he said. "Save half. Lend only what a man can repay. Build for winters, not summers, and never trust a storm, no matter how bright it shines." The mayor left disappointed there was no quick fix, but months later a letter arrived. They'd taken his words to heart. Families had saved seed, merchants had closed their wild accounts, and the town had made it through winter lean but alive. In the years that followed, more such letters came. Hollow Creek had become not just a town but a teacher, its lessons carried on the wind. Dreamers came too, though their eyes shone with different fire. A group of young men, calling themselves builders of a new frontier, stood in the square one spring, preaching to Hollow Creek folk. "Why stop at survival?" they cried. "Why not build a city of prosperity? Why not make Hollow Creek the center of the whole territory?" Their words stirred the restless youth, the ones who had never known hunger like their elders. For a moment the square buzzed with hope of something brighter, faster, grander. Tom listened, leaning on his cane now, hair white as frost. When the dreamers finished, he raised his voice. "I've heard promises like that before," he said. "They sound sweet, but they carry poison. A town greatness ain't in how tall its buildings stand nor how far its name carries. Greatness lies in how many winters its children survive.
how many debts are paid honest, how steady its people stand when storms roll in. If you want to build something true, build slow. Some muttered that Tom was old, too cautious, afraid of change, but others nodded, remembering what it meant to starve, remembering when Hollow Creek near drowned in ambition once before. The dreamers left, frustrated, and set their sights on other towns. Those towns grew bright for a season, then burned out like oil lamps left too long unattended. Hollow Creek, meanwhile, rolled steady, adding another ring to its tree. The most remarkable change came from within. The children who'd grown up under Tom's stern eye began teaching Dusty Creed without thinking of it as Dusty at all. They carved it into lessons, stitched it into stories, sang it in hymns at gatherings. Save half, they'd say, trust steady hands. They didn't remember the old oilskin ledger, nor the man who first scribbled in it by lamplight, but they lived it, and that was enough. One rainy night, Tom sat by his window, hearing the creek murmur and the roof strip steady. He thought of Dusty, thought of his own mistakes, thought of the town now stronger than either of them alone. He whispered to the night, "You were right, old man. Rivers outlast storms, and now, even if no one remembers your name, they'll live by your creed." The rain tapped like applause on the shingles, and in the hush between thunder, he swore he heard it again. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. Hollow Creek was no city. It never shone like Denver, never thundered with endless trains, but it became something rarer, a refuge, a place where trust weighed more than gold, where patience was wealth, and where every storm, no matter how fierce, broke itself against the bedrock of a river dug by men who believed slow was stronger than fast. As Hollow Creek Way spread, it began to stir unease in towns that had built themselves on noise and speed. Places upriver that once laughed at the safe town now found their own ledgers bleed red, their depots half empty, their streets lined with shuttered shops. Meanwhile, wagons still rolled steady into Hollow Creek, coins still clinked in the bank safe, and families there still ate through winter. It wasn't wealth that drew envy, it was survival. And survival, it seemed, was worth more than silver. Some towns tried to mimic Hollow Creek outright. They painted signs that read safe credit and honest trade, but their promises were hollow, meant only to lure desperate families. Within a season, those towns collapsed, their leaders ridiculed for wearing a mask they couldn't uphold. Others sent delegations to Hollow Creek, asking Tom to teach him Dusty Creed. Tom obliged, but he warned them plain. You can't buy patience with coin. You can't build trust in a day. If you want what we have, you must bleed for it in winters, endure in droughts, and save when the sun shines instead of spending it all. Some listened, some didn't. Those who did began to steady. Those who didn't were soon swept into memory, their names forgotten while Hollow Creek endured. The town itself kept growing, though never in leaps. A grist mill by the river expanded, providing flour for 3 counties. A tannery set up shop, employing young men who might have otherwise drifted away. The schoolhouse doubled its benches, and children scratched lessons into their slates, sums, letters, and the quiet rules of patience Dusty had left. The creed became less a saying and more a rhythm of daily life, lived without thought, as natural as drawn breath.
Tom, older now, walked slower, but his presence still carried weight. When disputes rose between merchants or families, he was called to sit and listen. He didn't shout, didn't judge harsh. He asked questions, measured answers, and when he finally spoke, folk trusted his word as if it were law. Some said the town needed no sheriff as long as Merriweather still drew breath. But storms never give up their chase. New men came, dressed not in slick suits, but in uniforms of companies that sought to swallow small towns into vast machines. They offered to buy out Hollow Creek Mill, its tannery, even the bank itself, promising bigger profits if everything ran under their banner. The council, tempted by visions of easier days, looked to Tom. His hands trembled with age as he leaned on his cane, but his voice was steady. If you sell your roots for coin, you'll have shade for a season and dust for a lifetime. Our wealth ain't in what we own, it in how we stand. The vote went his way, though just barely. The companies left, muttering that Hollow Creek was a fool town. But when those same companies crumbled years later, Hollow Creek still stood. By then, Tom's hair was white, his ledger-writing hand crooked with arthritis. Yet he still came to the bank each morning, set in the oilskin book beside newer ledgers. He knew few would open its pages anymore. Its entries were relics from a different age, but he kept it near as a reminder. To him, it wasn't numbers that mattered, but the weight of promises behind them. One evening, as rain tapped against the windows, he sat with a group of children who'd gathered to hear him speak. They asked him what made Hollow Creek different, why their town survived when others fell. He smiled faint, eyes glinting under the lamplight. Because we remembered something simple, he said, that storms always come, and storms always go. The only thing that lasts is what you build slow, what you tend steady, what you save for lean years. We didn't chase storms. We dug a river, and a river will carry you farther than a flood ever could. The children nodded, wide-eyed, not fully understanding, but the words sank into them all the same. Years later, when Tom would be gone, they would repeat those words to their own children, never remembering where they'd come from, and that was the point. The creed didn't belong to Dusty, nor to Tom, nor even to Hollow Creek anymore. It belonged to the world itself, stitched into the marrow of those who chose patience over panic. That night, as Tom closed the bank for the last time that week, he lingered in the doorway, listening to the creek outside murmur under the rain. He heard it plain as a whisper, low and steady. Don't chase storms. Dig rivers. He tipped his hat to the sound and walked home slow, content. Tom Merriweather's last years were marked by a quiet dignity. He no longer rode out to weigh a man's character over a handshake, nor did he stay late scratching numbers in the ledgers by candlelight. His steps had slowed, his back bent, but his mind was as sharp as the first day Dusty handed him the oilskin book. Most mornings he sat by the bank window, watching wagons roll through the square, children dashing past with laughter on their lips, merchants opening their shutters as the sun crept up over the ridge. Hollow Creek breathed steady, and that was enough for him. When Tom finally passed, peaceful in his sleep, with the sound of rain tapping soft on the roof, the whole town seemed to fall silent. Bells tolled low, merchants shuttered their shops, and families walked to the square in somber procession. They laid him to rest not with grand speeches, but with the words he'd spoken so often. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. Some said the rain that fell that day carried Dusty whisper along with it, mingling with Tom's own voice, two streams joining into one. His death left a weight in the air, a question hanging heavier than any storm cloud. Could Hollow Creek hold steady without Merriweather's hand on the ledger? For decades, the town had leaned on him to keep balance, to stand firm when storms tempted or threatened. Now the burden passed to the generation raised in his shadow. At first, uncertainty gnawed. Merchants argued more, eager to test their freedom. Farmers wondered if the bank would still lend fair without Tom's steady eye. Even the council quarreled, half recalling Dusty creed, half tempted by glittering offers from outside. But when the first real test came, the answer proved itself. That test arrived in the form of drought, less cruel than the ones Dusty had seen, but sharp enough to crack the soil and shrivel the fields. Families fretted, merchants worried, and whispers of abandoning the town stirred in back rooms. But the new keepers of Merriweather Bank, young Sarah Pruitt and Jacob Garner, opened the ledgers and held fast to the rules Tom had drilled into them. Lend small, spread wide, never overreach. They rationed coin, gave just enough to keep folks standing, and reminded everyone to save what little they had. It worked. The drought passed, lean but survivable. Hollow Creek buried fewer than other towns, and by the time rain returned, the square was alive again. Families whispered, Dusty River still runs, and confidence returned. Sarah and Jacob proved themselves worthy of the mantle, but they added their own touch. Where Tom had been stern, Sarah was patient with words, explaining each loan until even the poorest farmer understood. Where Tom had been rigid, Jacob was adaptable, finding new ways to balance trade with neighboring towns. Together they showed Hollow Creek that the creed wasn't just Dusty, nor Tom. It was a current anyone could carry, so long as they believed in it. The young folk, once restless, began to take pride in their town reputation. They built homes not just for themselves, but for children yet unborn. They planted orchards that wouldn't bear fruit for years, confident Hollow Creek would be there to enjoy them. Trust deepened, not because of one man's name, but because the whole community carried the river together. On the anniversary of Tom passing, families gathered in the square. Rain fell steady, as if the heavens themselves remembered. Sarah read aloud from the old oilskin ledger, its pages brittle but its words alive. Small loans repaid, names long forgotten, numbers that spoke louder than any sermon. The children recited the creed in unison, voices bright against the drizzle. Fortune don't come from speed, nor luck, nor loud talk. It comes from patience, trust, and keeping your eyes open when others shut theirs. And in the hush after, when the rain softened to a whisper, folks swore they heard it once more. Dusty and Tom together, or maybe the river itself. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. Hollow Creek stood without its founder, without its keeper, because the river was never in a man alone. It was in the soil, the people, the choices they made each season. And so long as they remembered that, no storm could wash it away.
The years that followed Tom passing marked the start of a new chapter, not just for Hollow Creek but for the valleys and ridges that stretched beyond it. What had once been whispered as the safe town slowly grew into something larger, a model. Other towns, wearied of collapsing under their own greed, began to look toward Hollow Creek for guidance. They sent delegations, merchants with worn ledgers, farmers with dust still clinging to their boots, even preachers hoping for wisdom to steady their congregations. Sarah Pruitt and Jacob Garner, now stewards of Meriwether Bank, received them in the same plain office where Dusty had once scratched nickels into his oilskin book and Tom had wrestled with his mistakes. They didn't wear fine suits, didn't boast of riches. They simply laid out the principles that had carried Hollow Creek through storm after storm. Save half, Sarah would say. Lend fair, but never more than a man can repay. Build for winters, not summers. Trust is your true coin. Jacob would nod and add, don't measure your worth by how loud you shout or how fast you rise. Measure it by how many winters your people survive. Some who heard left disappointed, still dreaming of shortcuts, but others took those words back to their towns and set about changing the way they lived. And in time, whispers spread of other places steadied by Hollow Creek's creed. A ridge town once near ruin now kept its barns full through lean seasons. A riverside camp, long known for gamblers and drifters, grew quiet and orderly, ledgers neat, debts repaid. Folks began to call it the Hollow Creek Way, though no one in Hollow Creek ever claimed ownership. The transformation wasn't without resistance. Ambitious men in larger cities mocked the creed as coward coin. They published broadsheets sneering that Hollow Creek patience was weakness, that its refusal to gamble meant it would always remain small. Yet when crashes came, when markets failed, when railroads cut off supplies, those same cities suffered ruin while Hollow Creek and its students endured. Each storm proved the river deeper, and mockery gave way to grudging respect. Meanwhile, life in Hollow Creek carried on quiet but rich. The orchards planted by the younger generation bore fruit, sweet and abundant, feeding families who'd once doubted whether the town would last. The fair held each spring grew into a tradition, not of spectacle but of gratitude. Families gathering to share what they'd saved, not flaunt what they'd wasted. Children grew up with Dusty words on their lips, though they barely knew who Dusty had been. The creed was no longer tied to a man or even a ledger. It was a rhythm, lived without thinking, like drawing breath. On the 50th year since Dusty's first oilskin ledger entry, the town gathered in the square under a soft drizzle. Sarah, her hair streaked with gray now, opened that very book fragile pages near dust and read aloud the first line. A loan of 2 cents to a farmer who'd repaid in full come harvest. This, she told the children gathered at her feet, is the seed that grew into your lives today. Not because of the amount, but because of the trust. Never forget that trust is what feeds you. The children listened wide-eyed, not fully understanding, but the weight of her words sank deep. And when the rain thickened, voices rose once more, as they always had. Fortune don't come from speed, nor luck, nor loud talk. It comes from patience, trust, and keeping your eyes open when others shut theirs. In that moment, Hollow Creek felt less like a town and more like a river itself, its current spreading outward, joining with others, shaping the land. Dusty whisper, Tom's struggle, Sarah and Jacob guidance, all had become part of something larger, a way of life that no storm could erase. The safe town had become the steady heart of a region, and its river rolled on, quiet and eternal as rain. In the decades that followed, Hollow Creek became less a place on a map and more a name carried like a lantern in the dark. Travelers would pass through distant valleys, their wagons creaking under the weight of meager belongings, and someone at a campfire would whisper, if you're looking for steadiness, find Hollow Creek. They might not know where it lay exactly, but the name itself was enough to kindle hope. A town that had no mines, no factories, no roar of trains, yet endured while others rose and crumbled, had become a legend of its own. Sarah Pruitt and Jacob Garner grew old, their hair silver, their hands knotted with years of writing and reckoning. They trained younger clerks, taught apprentices not only how to balance columns but how to listen. A loan ain't numbers on paper, Jacob told one young man, it a promise written flesh and blood. If you forget the man behind the coin, you'll lose the coin and the man both. Sarah would nod, add in it, and if you give more than a man can bear, you're not helping him, you're burying him. Those lessons soaked into the next generation, and the bank remained steady long after its stewards passed into memory. By then, Hollow Creek creed had spread so far it was spoken by people who had never laid eyes on the square or the little bank with its plain sign. Farmers upriver told their sons to save half, not realizing they were repeating Dusty words. Merchants in towns miles away balanced their books cautious, saying better a slow trickle than a flood, never knowing Tom once spoke the same after nearly drowning in his own ambition. The creed had become larger than its source and inheritance passed down without names attached. Of course, not all embraced it. There were always those who scoffed, calling Hollow Creek way too small, too timid. Boomtowns still flared up, fueled by silver strikes or cattle deals, and for a season they glittered brighter than Hollow Creek ever did. But storms always come, and floods always fade. When those towns collapsed, their folk drifted, weary and broke, seeking refuge. And where did they end up? More often than not, at the banks of Hollow Creek, where patience still flowed like water through dry land. The square itself changed little through the years. Buildings aged, new boards nailed over old, the schoolhouse expanded, the mill wheel turned steady, but the heart remained the same. Each spring, families gathered as they always had, letting rain fall on their faces, speaking the words that no longer felt like a creed from a man but like law carved into the bones of the earth. Fortune don't come from speed, nor luck, nor loud talk. It comes from patience, trust, and keeping your eyes open when others shut theirs. Children recited it with the ease of nursery rhymes, never asking who first spoke it. Elders nodded, remembering hunger, remembering storms, remembering that only steady hands had carried them through. The names of Dusty and Tom faded, then blurred, then slipped into silence. Yet their river ran on, unbroken. Travelers who stayed long enough often asked, puzzled, who started all this? Who wrote the creed? Some townsfolk shrugged, saying it had always been so. Others spoke vague of old Merriweather or a man named Dusty, but the details grew hazy. And maybe that was how it was meant to be. The river no longer needed its source, remembered to keep flowing. One rainy night, as lanterns flickered across the square and children's voices carried the creed into the dusk, a gray-haired farmer stood listening. He turned to a stranger beside him and said, "You hear that? That why this town stands when others fall. It ain't the soil, it ain't the creek, it ain't even the bank, it's the way we live." And in the hush that followed, the rain seemed to murmur along, "Don't chase storms, dig rivers." Hollow Creek was no longer just a town. It was an idea, a legend, a way of life. And that was a fortune no storm could ever take. Around fire pits and under the long shadows of frontier nights, Hollow Creek's story turned to folklore. Drifters who'd never set foot near its square spun tales of the safe town where families never starved and debts were always paid fair. Some swore the town had no sheriff because it never needed one. That trust itself was law. Others claimed the rain never failed there, that crops rose steady as sunrise because the land respected patience. The truth was simpler. Hollow Creek suffered droughts, floods, hunger, same as any place. But the creed made those storms survivable, and surviving became its own kind of miracle. Campfire storytellers embroidered the tale. They spoke of a ghostly banker who still walked the creek at night, whispering warnings to those who spent too much too quick. Children shivered at the story, but farmers listened quiet, taking the lesson to heart. In time, the names Dusty and Tom vanished from most tellings. They became the first keeper and the one who stumbled but returned. Their faces faded, their ledgers forgotten, but their creed lived on, dressed in myth. Travelers carried the legend eastward, past mountains and plains. A man might settle in a town 100 miles away and still hear the phrase, "Fortune don't come from speed, nor luck, nor loud talk. It comes from patience, trust, and keeping your eyes open when others shut theirs." Children recited it with the ease of nursery rhymes, never asking who first spoke it. Elders nodded, remembering hunger, remembering storms, remembering that only steady hands had carried them through. The names of Dusty and Tom faded, then blurred, then slipped into silence, yet their river ran on, unbroken. Travelers who stayed long enough often asked, puzzled, who started all this? Who wrote the creed? Some townsfolk shrugged, saying it had always been so. Others spoke vague of old Merriweather or a man named Dusty, but the details grew hazy, and maybe that was how it was meant to be. The river no longer needed its source, remembered to keep flowing. One rainy night, as lanterns flickered across the square and children's voices carried the creed into the dusk, a gray-haired farmer stood listening. He turned to a stranger beside him and said, "You hear that? That why this town stands when others fall. It ain't the soil, it ain't the creek, it ain't even the bank, it's the way we live." And in the hush that followed, the rain seemed to murmur along, "Don't chase storms, dig rivers." Hollow Creek was no longer just a town. It was an idea, a legend, a way of life. And that was a fortune no storm could ever take. Around fire pits and under the long shadows of frontier nights, Hollow Creek's story turned to folklore. Drifters who'd never set foot near its square spun tales of the safe town where families never starved and debts were always paid fair. Some swore the town had no sheriff because it never needed one. That trust itself was law. Others claimed the rain never failed there, that crops rose steady as sunrise because the land respected patience. The truth was simpler. Hollow Creek suffered droughts, floods, hunger, same as any place, but the creed made those storms survivable. And surviving became its own kind of miracle. Campfire storytellers embroidered the tale. They spoke of a ghostly banker who still walked the creek at night, whispering warnings to those who spent too much too quick. Children shivered at the story, but farmers listened quiet, taking the lesson to heart. In time, the names Dusty and Tom vanished from most tellings. They became the first keeper and the one who stumbled but returned. Their faces faded, their ledgers forgotten, but their creed lived on, dressed in myth. Travelers carried the legend eastward, past mountains and plains. A man might settle in a town 100 miles away and still hear the phrase, "Fortune don't come from speed, nor luck, nor loud talk. It comes from patience, trust, and keeping your eyes open when others shut theirs." Children recited it with the ease of nursery rhymes, never asking who first spoke it. Elders nodded, remembering hunger, remembering storms, remembering that only steady hands had carried them through. The names of Dusty and Tom faded, then blurred, then slipped into silence, yet their river ran on, unbroken. Travelers who stayed long enough often asked, puzzled, who started all this? Who wrote the creed? Some townsfolk shrugged, saying it had always been so. Others spoke vague of old Merriweather or a man named Dusty, but the details grew hazy, and maybe that was how it was meant to be. The river no longer needed its source remembered to keep flowing. One rainy night, as lanterns flickered across the square and children's voices carried the creed into the dusk, a gray-haired farmer stood listening. He turned to a stranger beside him and said, "You hear that? That why this town stands when others fall. It ain't the soil, it ain't the creek, it ain't even the bank, it's the way we live." And in the hush that followed, the rain seemed to murmur along, "Don't chase storms, dig rivers." Hollow Creek was no longer just a town. It was an idea, a legend, a way of life. And that was a fortune no storm could ever take. Around fire pits and under the long shadows of frontier nights, Hollow Creek's story turned to folklore. Drifters who'd never set foot near its square spun tales of the safe town where families never starved and debts were always paid fair. Some swore the town had no sheriff because it never needed one, that trust itself was law. Others claimed the rain never failed there, that crops rose steady as sunrise because the land respected patience. The truth was simpler. Hollow Creek suffered droughts, floods, hunger same as any place, but the creed made those storms survivable, and surviving became its own kind of miracle. Campfire storytellers embroidered the tale. They spoke of a ghostly banker who still walked the creek at night, whispering warnings to those who spent too much too quick. Children shivered at the story, but farmers listened quiet, taking the lesson to heart. In time, the names Dusty and Tom vanished from most tellings. They became the first keeper and the one who stumbled but returned. Their faces faded, their ledgers forgotten, but their creed lived on, dressed in myth. Travelers carried the legend eastward, past mountains and plains. A man might settle in a town 100 miles away and still hear the phrase, "Fortune don't come from speed, nor luck, nor loud talk. It comes from patience, trust, and keeping your eyes open when others shut theirs." Children learned it before they knew their letters. Some thought it a prayer, others a rhyme, others simply the way things were. By the time they grew old enough to leave Hollow Creek, the creed was stitched into them so deep it never left, no matter where they settled. And so the river widened, season after season, carried by people who didn't even know where the water first flowed. Far-off towns built monuments to the safe town, though none of them matched the truth. Statues of ghostly bankers, legends of magic ledgers that filled with coin overnight, tales of rain that never stopped falling, all nonsense embroidered by distance. Yet even in the falsehoods, the root stayed true. Patience outlasts panic, rivers outlast storms. That was the fortune folk clung to. Back in Hollow Creek, old-timers would smile when travelers came speaking of those wild stories. "Ain't no magic here," they'd say, leaning on canes, just folks saving when they can, helping each other stand when storms roll through, that all, and that enough. They knew the truth was simpler than myth, but they didn't mind the legends. After all, rivers don't care what names men give them, they just keep flowing. And on quiet nights when thunder rumbled far off and rain pattered on the rooftops, the town still felt the whisper in its bones. It no longer belonged to Dusty, nor Tom, nor Sarah, nor Jacob. It belonged to the land itself, eternal as breath. Don't chase storms, dig rivers.
The Hollow Creek way had become more than creed, more than history, more than legend. It was a law unspoken, carried in the marrow of a people, shaping lives they'd never know, stretching farther than memory could reach. And like the river it was named for, it showed no sign of stopping. Generations rolled on until Hollow Creek creed was no longer tied to any single valley or ridge. It had seeped into the fabric of whole cultures. Laws were written in distant courts that echoed the town quiet wisdom, restrictions on reckless loans, rules demanding grain be stored for lean years, charters praising honest trade over empty boasting. When scribes copied those words into ledgers of law, they never knew they were putting dusty voice to paper, yet there it was, dressed in official ink, alive in the bones of governments that had never seen the bend of Hollow Creek River. Songs carried it too. Children sang rhymes about the town that stood through storms, their voices ringing in schoolhouses 1,000 miles from the old square. Balladeers wove verses about rivers that carved deeper than floods, about steady hands outlasting thunder. None of them knew they were singing of a mule driver nickel scratched into an oilskin ledger. They thought it older, a truth born with the land. And maybe, by then, it was. Merchants in far-off ports struck bargains slower, weighing trust heavier than coin. They spoke of creaking it, a phrase meaning to choose patience over haste, a fair deal over a flashy one. Farmers in dry plains carved root cellars deep, quoting sayings they believed were as ancient as scripture: save half, live twice. And when storms rattled windows in towns that had never even heard of Merryweather's, families comforted each other with words that had traveled on the wind for centuries. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. Meanwhile, Hollow Creek itself remained small. The square was still plain, the bank still modest, the creek still murmured the same. Outsiders often arrived expecting marvels, golden streets, endless harvests, some hidden miracle. What they found instead was simpler. Folk mending fences, sweeping porches, balancing ledgers with neat hands. Some left disappointed, others stayed, realizing the miracle wasn't in wealth but in steadiness. On the 200th year since Dusty first loaned, the townsfolk gathered under rain as always. By then, no one remembered his name, nor Tom, nor Sarah. The oilskin ledger was gone, crumbled to dust long before. But the creed was spoken still, loud and strong in the voices of children and elders alike. Fortune don't come from speed, nor luck, nor loud talk. It comes from patience, trust, and keeping your eyes open when others shut theirs. They spoke it not as memory, but as law, as natural as thunder following lightning. That night, as lanterns flickered in windows and the creek rolled on in its crooked bed, some swore the rain itself spoke. Not words exactly, but a rhythm, a murmur, a truth. Rivers endure, floods fade. It was the same lesson Dusty had whispered to himself by lamplight, the same Tom had wept over when his ambition near drowned the town. It had outlasted them, outlasted their names, outlasted even memory. And so the Hollow Creek way, born of patience and trust, lived on not as story, nor even as legend, but as the pulse of a people, quiet, unshaken, eternal as rain. Centuries after Dusty first scratched numbers into that oilskin ledger, the Hollow Creek Creed was no longer thought of as something men invented. It was spoken of like sunrise or gravity, part of the order of things. Scholars wrote treatises about the law of steady flow, comparing it to rivers carving valleys and roots holding hillsides in place. They didn't cite Dusty or Tom, didn't mention Hollow Creek at all. To them, it was a natural truth, ancient as stone. In markets across vast regions, merchants quoted proverbs that traced their bloodline back to Hollow Creek without ever knowing it. Fast coin burns, slow coin builds. A deal is only as good as the man who keeps it through winter. Never bet on a flood when a river runs nearby. These sayings guided trades, shaped laws, and settled disputes. Judges leaned on them in rulings. Farmers carved them above barn doors. Sailors scratched them on ship rails, believing they warded off ruin. The story of Hollow Creek itself blurred into myth. Some said it was a hidden town guarded by rain spirits. Others claimed no such place had ever existed, that the safe town was a parable dreamed up by weary folk who needed a tale of survival. Yet through all the contradictions, the creed itself remained. Folk lived by it whether or not they believed the town was real. Back in the little valley where it all began, Hollow Creek still stood. Smaller than the cities that roared with iron and glass, plainer than the ports that glittered with sails and lights, but steadier than both. Its bank was still modest, its square still muddy come spring, its people still gathering each year under rain to speak the old words. They didn't call it tradition anymore, they called it life. Children grew up thinking patience and trust were as natural as the seasons. Elders nodded, proud, though few could remember who first taught it. One spring, as thunder rolled far off and the rain came down soft, a traveler asked an old farmer leaning on his cane, "Why do you people keep gathering in the rain? What do you think it brings you?" The farmer chuckled, rainwater dripping from the brim of his hat. "It don't bring us nothing," he said. "It just reminds us of what already here. Storms come, storms go. Rivers run on, and so do we." The traveler left puzzled, but the children who overheard tucked those words into their hearts, just as countless generations had before. And when night fell, the town quiet under lantern glow, the creek whispering in its crooked bed, the rain seemed to murmur with it. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. No one claimed those words anymore. No one needed to. They had become the marrow of a people, the steady hum of a world that had learned, through trial and storm, that fortune belongs not to the loud nor the lucky, but to the patient who keep building even when the sky is dark.
Thus, the Hollow Creek Creed slipped its chains of history and became something larger, an unwritten law, eternal as rain, as ordinary and as sacred as breath. By the time Hollow Creek 3rd and 4th centuries passed into dust, the town itself had near vanished from maps. Larger cities grew up around rail hubs and river ports, their skylines glittering with iron and glass, while Hollow Creek stayed modest, a speck of quiet farms and muddy streets. Travelers sometimes passed through, surprised that the fabled safe town was no grand city at all but a simple place of barns and ledgers. They shook their heads, saying, "How could such plain folk have birthed the creed that shaped half the land?" But whether they believed it or not, the creed had long since outgrown its cradle. In the cities, professors taught the law of endurance, writing in thick books that fortunes built on patience always outlasted gambles. They never once mentioned Hollow Creek. Politicians quoted sayings about trust and steady hands as though they were their own. Poets sang of rivers that carved valleys while floods faded into mud. Whole cultures leaned on truths that had first been scratched in dusty little oilskin ledger, though his name had been forgotten centuries before. The town itself carried on quiet. Children still gathered in the square each spring when the rains came, though they no longer knew why. They lifted their faces to the sky, laughing as water streamed down their cheeks, and spoke words older than memory. Fortune don't come from speed, nor luck, nor loud talk. It comes from patience, trust, and keeping your eyes open when others shut theirs. To them it wasn't tradition. It was simply the way the world was. Outsiders often called it superstition. Why gather in the rain, they'd ask, and the townsfolk would shrug. Because storms pass, rivers run, and it's good to remember both. They didn't argue, didn't try to prove nothing. They just kept living the way their fathers and mothers had, steady as the creek itself. Legends grew wilder the farther they traveled. Some claimed Hollow Creek never truly existed, that it was a story dreamed up to warn against greed. Others swore the town was guarded by a ghostly banker who still wrote ledgers in the rain. A few even said the river itself whispered the creed to any who bent close enough. The truth was quieter. Hollow Creek was just a little town that chose patience when others chose panic, and that choice carried farther than its founders ever dreamed. One spring evening, as lanterns glowed and the rain hissed on rooftops, a boy asked his grandmother, who first spoke those words we say in the rain. She paused, eyes wrinkling with thought, then shook her head. "Don't rightly know," she admitted. "Maybe no one, maybe the world itself." The boy nodded, satisfied, for to him the creed felt as natural as thunder following lightning. And perhaps that was the truest fate of Hollow Creek, to disappear as a name, yet endure as a law of life. The town might fade to a dot forgotten by cartographers, its bank crumble to dust, its ledgers lost to time, but the river it dug, the river of patience, trust, and steady hands, would keep on flowing crooked and eternal as rain. And when storms rolled across the land, beating their drums and shouting their noise, men and women who had never heard of Hollow Creek still heard the whisper deep in their marrow. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. As centuries piled like driftwood on a riverbank, Hollow Creek itself slipped from living memory. Maps no longer marked its muddy square, and travelers passed the bend without noticing the cabins tucked between fields. The bank, once the heart of the town, sagged into ruin, timbers worn soft with rot, the safe rusted shut. The last clerk who remembered Dusty Ledger was long in the ground, and no one in Hollow Creek, or what little remained of it, could point to where the first words had been spoken. Yet the creed lived on, untethered from place or name. It drifted through villages and cities alike, whispered by mothers to children on stormy nights, etched by merchants above their shop doors, woven into the chants of sailors and the prayers of farmers. It had become a current in the marrow of mankind, accepted as natural law rather than invention. People said it the way they said the sun would rise. Fortune don't come from speed, nor luck, nor loud talk. It comes from patience, trust, and keeping your eyes open when others shut theirs. By then, no one asked who first spoke it. Some claimed it was as old as the rivers themselves, that water taught it to men who listened close enough. Others said the earth had carved it into their bones, same as hunger or thirst. A few scholars argued it must have begun as a proverb of farmers or traders, but even they admitted its source was lost in mist. And so the Hollow Creek Way, though nameless, flowed stronger than ever, an eternal whisper, unbound from the soil where it was born. In faraway lands, laws were written with its rhythm hidden in their lines. Save half, spend fair, trust honest hands. Markets rose and fell, empires crumbled and reformed, but the creed threaded through it all, the one steady truth no storm could wash away. Families survived wars and famine because they heeded its quiet call. Generations who never knew Hollow Creek, who had never even heard its name, still lived by the river it had dug. Back where the creek once curved, the land grew wild again. Cottonwoods that had fallen long ago were replaced by new trees, their roots deep in the same soil where Dusty once stood. Rain still tapped soft against leaves, and the river still murmured its crooked song. Travelers who camped nearby sometimes swore they heard voices in the storm hush, not men, not memory, but the land itself whispering, "Don't chase storms, dig rivers." And perhaps by then it was true. Perhaps the creed had shed its human skin entirely and become what it always sought to be, a law of the earth, as constant as thunder, as patient as stone, as eternal as rain. The town was gone, the names forgotten, but the fortune remained, etched not in ledgers nor in monuments, but in the marrow of humankind. In the ages that followed, the Hollow Creek Creed shed the last of its ties to men and towns. Folk no longer even wondered where it came from, for to them it had always been. It lived in the cadence of work songs sung at dawn, in the proverbs muttered over plows, in the way merchants weighed trust heavier than glittering coin. No one thought to ask who had first whispered it, any more than they'd ask who first taught the wind to blow or the river to run. Children learned it before they knew their letters. They spoke it while splashing in puddles, rain running down their cheeks, laughing at storms instead of fearing them. Farmers carved it into gateposts, sailors painted it on their hulls, judges leaned on it when handing down rulings. It became so tangled into daily life that it was no longer called a creed or a saying. It was simply truth. In markets, folks spoke of the riverway meaning to trade fair, to save against lean days, to keep one seeing and eyes open while others blinded themselves with greed. In songs, minstrels sang of storms crashing loud and proud, only to fade, while rivers, crooked and quiet, outlasted them all. And in prayers, mothers whispered thanks not just for harvests or shelter, but for patience itself, the invisible wealth that had carried their kin through centuries. Far from the old bend where Hollow Creek once stood, whole nations began carving laws and customs that bore the river rhythm. Taxes were stored against famine, trade routes were built slow but strong. Contracts were written cautious, favoring endurance over spectacle. Scholars scribbling in heavy tomes claimed these ways were the natural order of fortune. They wrote of rivers and floods, of steadiness and collapse, never imagining they were echoing a mule driver halfpenny scratched into a ragged oilskin ledger long buried in dust. And yet, even as the creed dissolved into nature itself, there were nights when rain fell steady and thunder rolled far off, when folks swore they heard it clearer than ever, not in words, but in the hush of water against stone, in the rhythm of drops hitting rooftops, in the murmur of rivers running crooked through valleys. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. The names had vanished, the town forgotten, the ledger turned to dust. But the fortune endured, etched into the marrow of a people, lived without question, eternal as rain. By the time another 100 seasons had turned, Hollow Creek itself was little more than a ghost of a story. Wanderers at campfires argued over whether the place had ever truly existed. Some swore they had kin who'd once lived there, honest folk who'd built lives steady as stone. Others laughed and called it a parable, just another fireside yarn to scare men off greed and remind them to save against winter. Yet even as they argued, both sides spoke the same creed without thinking, like breathing. Fortune don't come from speed nor luck nor loud talk. It comes from patience, trust, and keeping your eyes open when others shut theirs. It was in lullabies sung to restless children, in the sermons of preachers who claimed it as holy writ, in the quiet advice of fathers to sons heading out into a storm. The creed had shed its skin of history so completely that Hollow Creek was now less a town remembered and more a ghost whispered of in the rain. Scholars who dug into folklore found fragments, mentions of a banker with ledgers, a safe town by a creek, a gathering each spring in the rain. But records were too few, names too scattered. They debated endlessly. Was Hollow Creek a real settlement, a symbol for a dozen towns stitched together by memory? Or had it never existed at all, born only in the imaginations of tired farmers and broke miners seeking comfort? No one could say for sure. Yet the creed itself, steady as ever, needed no proof. It lived in markets, in harvests, in the way men and women planned for winters with quiet faith. In the bend where Hollow Creek once lay, the land had gone wild again. Forest pressed in close, grass swallowed the last stones of its square. The bank was gone, its timbers melted into soil, its safe rusted deep in earth. Only the creek remained, crooked and calm, whispering the same song it always had. Travelers who camped nearby spoke of odd dreams, visions of rain-soaked townsfolk standing in a square, reciting words they did not know by day but remembered by night. Some left spooked, calling it a haunting. Others left humbled, carrying the words as if gifted to them by the land itself. And so Hollow Creek became both ghost story and gospel. Children dared each other to whisper its name at midnight, as if the ghostly banker might appear with his ledger in hand. Elders shook their heads and said, "Ghost or not, the words are true." In the end, it didn't matter whether the town had stood or not. The river of patience flowed on, deeper than memory, stronger than proof. On stormy nights when thunder rolled and rain hammered roofs, folk across the land felt it in their bones, the same murmur as always: don't chase storms, dig rivers. The ghost of Hollow Creek faded in and out of belief, but the creed never wavered. It no longer needed stone nor timber, name nor map. It had become the marrow of a people, a river without source or end, eternal as rain. In time, Hollow Creek name slipped so far into mist that it surfaced only in stories shaped by the tongues that told them. In one valley, folk spoke of a safe haven where people stood in the rain each spring, letting water wash fear from their faces. In another, the tale had twisted into one of a ghostly banker who carried a lantern through storms, marking in his ledger which souls had lived steady and which had squandered all. Elsewhere it was sung as a hymn of the quiet river that outlasted every flood, its waters feeding generations that never knew its source. Though the details changed, the heart never did. Farmers taught their children, save half, live steady. Merchants scrawled reminders in chalk above their stalls, better slow coin than no coin. Judges in high courts quoted lines they believed to be scripture: trust is the root of wealth. No one thought of Dusty or Tom, nor of a muddy square by a creek long gone to forest. The creed was too old now, too widespread. It had become as nameless as rain. Stories of Hollow Creek grew stranger the farther they traveled. Some told it as a paradise that vanished when greed first touched it, cursed to live only in memory. Others said it was still out there, hidden, appearing only to those who came to it in humility. Children dared each other to listen close during storms, claiming they could hear the town chanting from the thunder itself. Scholars rolled their eyes at such fancies, yet even they admitted the sayings that guided trade and law across nations bore the same rhythm, the same riverbed of thought. Meanwhile, the land where Hollow Creek once stood had grown thick with trees. The creek still wound its crooked course, fed by rains that never failed to fall. Now and again, a traveler wandering off the main trail would stumble upon that bend. They might camp there, listening to the murmur of water, and wake with words on their lips they couldn't explain. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. They'd carry the phrase back to their towns, swearing they'd heard it in a dream. The legend lived because the land itself whispered it. And so the Hollow Creek Creed passed fully into myth, its forms as many as raindrops, its truth as steady as the river that first bore it. Folk no longer needed to know where it came from, because by then it felt older than mankind. They didn't live it to honor a man or a town. They lived it because storms still came, floods still faded, and rivers still endured. Thus the fortune of Hollow Creek, born from patience and trust, outlasted all memory, outlasted even its own name. What began as a man choice with a single halfpenny had become a law of life, eternal as rain. As centuries turned to millennia, the Hollow Creek Creed no longer drifted as a single tale but fractured into 1,000 origin stories. Each culture that lived by it began to claim it as their own birthright, woven into their very beginnings. In the northern hills, tribes told of the first rain, when the sky wept wisdom upon the earth and taught their ancestors to save seed against hunger. In the eastern markets, merchants recited parables of the stone ledger, said to have fallen from the heavens, inscribed with laws of honest trade. Across the plains, farmers swore their people had always known the truth, that rivers endure where storms cannot. Each version wore a different cloak, yet beneath them all ran the same current: patience, trust, endurance. No one remembered Hollow Creek. No one spoke of Dusty or Tom or the oilskin ledger. But the river they had dug had spread wide, disguised as myth, scripture, folklore, and law. Folk lived by it without question, the way they breathed or planted or knelt to pray. Rulers built their kingdoms on it. Empires wrote it into charters. Even those who sought to twist it for power found themselves caught by its weight, for the people would not follow leaders who broke trust or squandered the stores meant for winter. Time and again, nations that forgot the creed collapsed, while those that remembered it endured. And so the law of Hollow Creek, though nameless, carved itself into the bones of civilization. The stories grew grander as distance widened. Some spoke of a river that had no end, flowing beneath the world, carrying the souls of the patient to safe shores. Others of a voice in the storm that judged men by how they kept their word. Still others told of a hidden town, glimpsed only in rain, where no one starved and no debt went unpaid. Pilgrims set out to find it, wandering valleys and ridges, but they never did. The truth was simpler, quieter. Hollow Creek had long since returned to earth, its square swallowed by trees, its bank melted into soil. Only the river remained, murmuring in the same song it always had.
Colonies that thrived were the ones that rationed fair, saved half their stores, lent trust only where it could be kept. Those that forgot, chasing storms of greed and haste, burned bright and then winked out, leaving only silent domes under strange skies. Historians recorded the pattern so often it became cliché. Storm worlds failed, river worlds endured. On the dust plains of Epsilon 3, children stood in rain machines, engineered to mimic the storms of Earth, and chanted words they believed as ancient as the stars. Fortune don't come from speed, nor luck, nor loud talk. It comes from patience, trust, and keeping your eyes open when others shut theirs. They never knew the square, the ledgers, the creek. To them it was scripture born in the void. On ocean worlds, sailors sang it into the foam, swearing the tides themselves answered. On frozen moons, miners scratched it into bulkheads above their bunks, comforted by its steady truth. Scholars, studying the rise and fall of civilizations, pointed to it as the one thread unbroken through human history. They gave it fine names, the principle of flow, the law of endurance, but their graphs and essays were only echo of a mule driver whisper in a lamplit room. And still, back on Earth, the little creek wound on. No marker, no monument, only water in a crooked bed. Animals drank from it, trees leaned over it, storms fed it. Once in a long while, a wanderer stumbled close, heard the hush, and felt a calm they couldn't explain. They woke speaking the same words their ancestors had carried to the stars. Don't chase storms. Dig rivers. Hollow Creek had vanished, its people long returned to dust, but its fortune had become mankind's inheritance, the one law that bound colonies light years apart, the one whisper that outlasted storms of war, famine, and pride. In the silence between stars, in the roar of alien winds, in the hush of rain on steel domes, the river still spoke. Storms fade, rivers endure, and through that endurance humanity endured with them. As mankind spread further into the black, their empires rose and fell like tides. Flags were planted, banners unfurled, languages fractured into thousands of tongues. Yet through all that scattering, one rhythm endured, the river creed. It wasn't written on constitutions nor carved on monuments. It lived quieter, in the marrow of daily life, binding colonies light years apart with a law older than kings. On the green hills of a terraformed world, a farmer taught his daughter to save half her seed, telling her, storms may take the rest, but patience will feed you. In the glass corridors of a station orbiting a gas giant, merchants struck bargains slow and fair, muttering better a river than a flood. And on the frozen outposts where survival meant rationing every crumb, children grew up learning to trust steady hands more than bright promises. None of them knew the names Dusty or Tom. They didn't know Hollow Creek had ever been a place, but they lived as if they had. Scholars began calling it the human inheritance. They traced it through ledgers and myths, through lullabies and law codes, through ship logs and court rulings. Every world that endured, they wrote, did so by the same rhythm. Storms fade, rivers endure. The phrase itself bent into 100 forms, yet always pointed back to the same truth. In time, the creed became more than survival. It became identity. Empires might war, colonies might rebel, but when storms broke, whether famine, war, or silence of the void, folk turned back to the river. They gathered, sometimes in rain, sometimes under recycled water dripping from steel ceilings, and spoke aloud the words their ancestors had carried unknown for millennia. Fortune don't come from speed, nor luck, nor loud talk. It comes from patience, trust, and keeping your eyes open when others shut theirs. Back on Earth, the valley where Hollow Creek once lay had grown wild, swallowed whole by forest. No one visited it anymore. Yet the creek still wound its crooked way, whispering through moss and roots. Travelers who strayed near swore the air felt heavier, as if soaked with memory. Some dreamed strange dreams, visions of townsfolk standing in rain, voices raising together. They woke unsettled, yet calm, and carried the murmur back out into the wide world. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. Thus humanity, scattered across stars, still beat with one quiet heart. Not empire, not nation, not crown nor coin could claim it. It belonged to no one and to all.
The river was their inheritance, the steady pulse that bound them closer than distance could tear apart. Storms would always rise, but the river would always endure, and so would they. When the day came that humankind met others among the stars, it was not fire nor conquest that bridged the gulf, but the River Creed. The first civilizations they encountered spoke in strange tongues, their bodies built of shapes and forms no man had dreamed. At first there was fear of storms louder than any thunder, of floods that might sweep humanity aside. But when the strangers traded, when they farmed, when they built, the same truth showed itself. Those who endured did so by patience, by trust, by slow rivers instead of raging floods. Scholars called it convergence, proof that endurance was no human invention but a law writ into the bones of life itself. Storms pass, rivers endure, they said, pointing to alien histories of collapsed empires, burned-out colonies, lost peoples who chased quick fortunes and perished. And though the words were shaped different in alien throats, the rhythm was the same. Across stars and across species, patience outlasted pride. Treaties were struck not with glittering promises, but with slow exchanges, each side given only what they could keep. When mistrust threatened war, voices on both sides reminded their people, rivers carved deeper than floods. And so peace held, fragile, crooked, but real. For the first time in the long story of mankind, the River Creed became more than human inheritance. It became universal. The principle that Dusty once whispered over a halfpenny scratched into a ledger by lamplight was now spoken beneath alien suns, shaping laws and bonds between worlds. Back on Earth, the valley where Hollow Creek once lay remained silent, forgotten by name. The creek wound its path through roots and stone, whispering the same song it always had. No one knew to call it birthplace. No one marked it with monument or shrine. And yet as rain fell and thunder rolled, travelers who camped nearby felt the same hush that had once stilled Dusty heart. They woke whispering truths they thought their own. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. In far-off colonies, in alien markets, in halls where voices of many species mingled, the same truth rose. It no longer mattered where it came from. It no longer mattered who first spoke it. The river had become the common tongue of survival, the compass not of one people but of all. Storms still roared, floods still tempted, but across stars, across species, across ages, the river endured, and in its endurance, so did they. As the centuries of starfaring wove mankind destiny together with other civilizations, the River Creed became more than survival, more than memory. It became foundation. Worlds of every kind, human colonies under alien suns, cities of beings whose forms glimmered like glass, stations orbiting stars that burned blue as fire, all carried the same quiet law. Storms roar and vanish, rivers flow and endure. At first it was spoken in trade halls, where merchants of different species weighed deals across tongues and customs. Trust weighs more than coin, one would say, and though the words came out in a dozen dialects, the meaning matched. Later it echoed in courts, as judges from worlds light years apart leaned on the same truth, better a steady bond than a loud boast. And in time it found its way into temples, into schools, into the marrow of societies that had once thought themselves unalike. Philosophers wrote it as cosmology. The universe itself favors rivers. Stars that burn slow live long. Galaxies spin patient. Planets endure by balance. Artists painted it as endless streams of light threading the void, while poets whispered it as lullaby to restless children who feared the dark. And though every tongue shaped it different, every hand painted it crooked in its own way, the rhythm held. Patience, trust, endurance. No one remembered Hollow Creek. No one remembered Dusty with his lamp, or Tom with his failings, or Sarah with her steady hand. The oilskin ledger was long since dust, but their choice, the river over the storm, had become the inheritance not just of humankind, but of countless peoples. The river was no longer story, it was culture. Back on Earth, the creek still wound its quiet path. Forests swallowed the last traces of the town. Rain fell as it always had, soft at first, then steady, drumming leaves and stone. Sometimes wanderers camped nearby, pausing on journeys with no thought of history. They woke from dreams speaking words they'd never learned. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. They carried them back out into the stars, unknowing, relearning what the land itself still hummed. In time, an interstellar council rose, a gathering not of empires but of worlds bound by trust. They called themselves no grand name, just the flow. Their laws were built on the River Creed, Every treaty, every pact, every judgment carried its echo. It was the only heritage that bound beings so different together, and in it they found common ground that even storms of war could not break. So the fortune of Hollow Creek, born of patience in a muddy square, became the pulse of civilizations. Storms still came, floods still tempted, but across the galaxies the river endured, and in that endurance, so did all who followed it. The river creed soon wove itself so deeply into the bones of interstellar life that folk ceased to call it a teaching at all. It was simply the way things were. Across galaxies, beings of shapes and voices strange to one another still spoke the same truth in their own tongues. Storms roar, floods tempt, but rivers endure. It was no longer confined to merchants or farmers. Entire civilizations wrote their charters with the river at the spine. Colonies carved it into their founding stones. Pilgrims carried drops of rainwater from their homeworlds in crystal vials, passing them down as sacred inheritance. Scholars charted history as storm ages and river ages, noting with precision how every blaze of conquest burned out while the slow builders lasted. Even war fleets, forged in fire, found themselves bound by it. Commanders who charged fast and loud fell quick, while those who moved steady, trust in their crews and planning for winters, carried their banners through centuries. In the art of the galactic age, rivers flowed everywhere. Murals of light streams adorned stations hanging in void. Songs sung in voices human and alien alike spoke of patience outlasting fury. On distant moons, children learned rhymes older than their bloodlines. Fortune don't come from speed, nor luck, nor loud talk. It comes from patience, trust, and keeping your eyes open when others shut theirs. They never knew it was once whispered by weary farmers on Earth. To them it was eternal law, older than suns. Back in the Forgotten Valley, the creek still whispered its crooked song. The town had long since melted into soil, names buried deeper than roots. Only the water remained, murmuring what it always had. Now and again a traveler stumbled there, scientist, wanderer, dreamer, and left shaken, whispering words they could not place. They carried them back across stars, unknowing they had returned to the birthplace of the law that ruled their age. In council chambers where dozens of species gathered, disputes flared bright as storms. Voices rose, threats cracked like thunder. And yet, in the end, the same refrain returned. Someone would speak it in their own tongue, another would echo it in theirs, until the whole hall stilled. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. The words needed no translation. They were carved deeper than language, deeper than history. Thus the river became not just creed nor culture, but the spine of a galactic age. Empires called themselves eternal, banners boasted of glory. Storms still rose, but beneath it all the river whispered, and those who heeded it endured. Those who ignored it vanished. The fortune of Hollow Creek, born from a single halfpenny and a stubborn choice beside a muddy stream, had grown into the heartbeat of stars themselves. Storms passed, rivers flowed, and in their flow, civilizations found their forever. As ages stretched beyond measure, stars themselves began to dim, their light burning slow toward silence. Galaxies thinned, their arms unraveling like old ropes. Yet even then, among civilizations that had spanned millennia, the river creed remained. Folk no longer thought of it as advice, nor even as law. It was the eternal current, the quiet truth they trusted as the cosmos itself aged. In worlds orbiting red suns, frail but steady, elders told their children, "Do not fear the dark. Stars may fade, but rivers run longer than floods." Pilgrims crossed the gulfs between dying systems, carrying seeds, stories, and trust. They did not chase the roar of collapsing suns. They built slow, steady sanctuaries, each one a drop feeding the great river of survival. Philosophers watching galaxies unravel declared the creed not merely cosmic law but timeless essence. It is the song by which the universe itself endures, they wrote. Storms blaze in glory but leave ash. The river flows on, long after light is gone, and across the scattered remnants of a once bright cosmos, people nodded, knowing the words were true in their marrow. On a long abandoned earth, the valley where Hollow Creek once stood had grown wild and ancient. The creek still wound its crooked way, rain-fed, whispering the same murmur it always had. No cities, no towns, no ledgers, only water, roots, and sky. Yet in its hush was the same voice, eternal as breath. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. The soil itself seemed to hum it, though no human ear remained to listen. Among the stars, beings who had never set foot on Earth still gathered in their own ways. Some stood beneath artificial rains on ships sailing through black void. Others carved streams of light into the hulls of stations, symbols of endurance against endless night. And when they spoke their final prayers before settling into sleep beneath fading suns, the words came in 100 tongues, yet always meant the same. Storms pass, rivers endure. Thus the fortune of Hollow Creek, once a lesson in a dusty ledger, once a whisper by a fire, had become the marrow of existence itself. It bound together not just men, not just civilizations, but the long twilight of the universe. Storms had roared and died. Empires had risen and fallen. Stars themselves would one day wink away. But the river had no end. In the far twilight of the cosmos, when stars burned only as red embers and galaxies had thinned into lonely strands of light, the river creed still flowed. Civilizations had dwindled. Some folded into silence, others migrated into the dark, but wherever voices endured, they spoke the same quiet truth. It was no longer history, no longer even memory. It was breath, it was rhythm, it was the pulse of being itself. On worlds where the sun gave little warmth, children gathered beneath domes of glass while elders recited the words as if they were cradle song. Fortune don't come from speed, nor luck, nor loud talk. It comes from patience, trust, and keeping your eyes open when others shut theirs. The young did not ask where the words came from. They believed them to be older than light itself, stitched into the marrow of existence. Great stations drifting in void carved glowing rivers across their hulls, reminders that even when stars failed, currents endured. Pilgrims carried vials of ancient water across the gulfs, pouring drops on new soil in reverence. Each drop was a covenant, a promise. Storms may roar, but rivers carve forever. Philosophers of the fading age wrote solemnly, storms are noise, brief and loud. The river is silence, long and deep. And in the end, only silence remains. To them, the creed was no longer about survival alone. It was the very script by which the universe faded gracefully. Stars collapsed, floods of light vanished, but the river, invisible and eternal, flowed still. Back on Earth, long abandoned, the valley of Hollow Creek lay cloaked in forest and shadow. The town was dust, the bank rotted, the names forgotten. Yet the creek still wound through moss and stone, rain-fed, murmuring in its crooked hymn. No ear remained to hear it, but the song did not falter. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. It was as though the land itself had become voice, speaking to no one and everyone at once. And in the scattered corners of a dimming universe, travelers, human and not, still felt that whisper, not in words, but in instinct, to save, to trust, to endure, to flow. It was the one law storms had never broken, the one fortune that outlasted kings, suns, and even time itself. So the creed of Hollow Creek, born of patience in a muddy square, carried into the last chapters of creation, not as story, not as memory, but as the marrow of existence. Storms had roared, floods had raged, stars themselves had burned and died, but the river endured, and in its endurance, so did all who followed it. In the final hush of the universe, when the last great suns had guttered into embers and the night stretched endless, the river creed was still there. No longer sung in bustling markets or etched in ledgers, no longer raised in squares filled with rain-soaked townsfolk. It was breathed soft in the silence by the few who remained. Travelers drifting through the dark spoke it as prayer, as comfort, as compass. Storms had roared and passed, but the river still flowed, unseen, eternal. Whole civilizations had been born, flourished, and folded back into dust. Names that once thundered like empires were gone, their monuments scattered to cosmic wind. Yet in the smallest colonies huddled round fading heat, children still learned it by heart. They did not ask where it came from. They believed it as surely as they believed in breath. Fortune don't come from speed, nor luck, nor loud talk. It comes from patience, trust, and keeping your eyes open when others shut theirs. And back on Earth, quiet beneath forgotten constellations, the valley of Hollow Creek was nothing but soil, trees, and a crooked line of water trickling through moss. No hand tilled the ground, no boot trod its banks, yet the creek ran, rain-fed, whispering to no one and to all. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. Perhaps it was no longer even memory of men. It was the world itself humming its truth into the bones of stone and root. Philosophers of the Dusk Age wrote their last thoughts in fragile scripts, saying the universe ends as it began, with storms that roar and fade, and a river that endures. To live by the river is to live in step with time itself. Their words, scattered among the stars, were found and repeated until even they too slipped into silence. But the river needed no books to remain. It had become instinct, the marrow of every hand that saved, every voice that trusted, every heart that endured. When the final lights dwindled and the great silence fell, what lingered was not the noise of storms nor the pride of empires. What lingered was a current, soft and steady, unbroken as rain. The river was there, as it always had been, as it always would be. And so the fortune of Hollow Creek, born in mud, in patience, in a halfpenny scribbled by lamplight, proved greater than storm, greater than empire, greater even than stars. It carried creation into its last breath, whispering still, don't chase storms, dig rivers. In the long silence after the last suns winked out, when galaxies had thinned to ghosts and even time seemed to lose its stride, the river creed endured as poetry without speaker, as rhythm without drum. There were no more squares filled with folk standing in the rain, no more ledgers marked in careful ink, no more children chanting the words around hearths. Yet the truth itself, quiet, patient, eternal, still moved like a current through the dark. Storms were gone, their roaring was long forgotten. Empires that once thundered had dissolved into ash, names had vanished, monuments crumbled, songs silenced. But the river did not need memory, it did not need voices, it had outgrown them. It had become the marrow of what remained, an inheritance carved into the bones of existence itself. Philosophers of the Dusk Age had guessed at this, writing in their last fragile scrolls, when all things fall quiet, the river alone will sing. And so it was. Not a song men could hear, nor gods could command, but a hum in the fabric of the void, steady as the beat of a hidden heart. Back on Earth, if Earth could still be named, buried beneath eons of silence, the valley where Hollow Creek once ran lay dark, its creek dried or hidden, its soil swallowed by the ages. Yet in some corner of the cosmos, in some unseen rhythm, its whisper lingered. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. Not as words, not as creed, not even as thought, but as the eternal pattern that once made stars burn steady. Rivers carve valleys, children grow into parents, and civilizations endure through winters. The fortune of Hollow Creek had become the final poetry of existence itself. All else was silence, but the river flowed still, eternal as rain never fallen, eternal as breath never drawn. Storms had passed, rivers endured, and in that endurance, even the dark was not empty. In the deep hush where even light no longer walked, the river remained, not as water, not as words, but as the hidden seed of all things. Storms had roared and died, suns had burned and fallen to ash, yet the current that once whispered through a muddy creek in a forgotten valley had not ceased. It lingered as rhythm in the void, patient as ever, waiting.
Somewhere beyond silence, philosophers once imagined there would come a dawn. They had written in their final books, the river endures not to vanish, but to carry forward. Even when darkness reigns, the current runs beneath, bearing the seed of tomorrow. And though their ink had long since faded, their words proved true. For in the quiet, in the endless dark, the river carried its covenant. Storms pass, rivers endure. It was no longer tied to mankind, nor even to the stars they once scattered across. It had become the marrow of existence itself, and from marrow new flesh could always grow. Perhaps it would be eons, perhaps ages beyond ages, but patience was never in a hurry. Patience had forever. Back where Hollow Creek once wound its crooked way, the soil had long since shifted, stone broken down, waters vanished. Yet in some unknowable corner of the dark, the pattern stirred again, a spark, faint as breath caught in the current. Like seed lodged deep in frozen ground, waiting through endless winters, it began to move. And though no tongue could name it, no eye could see it, the river was there, guiding it as it always had. When that spark grew, when dawn came again, when light pierced the void after eons of dark, it would not roar like a storm. It would flow, quiet and steady. And whatever lives rose to greet it, whether men again or something else entirely, they would feel in their marrow the same truth that had carried all before them. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. Thus the fortune of Hollow Creek, born from patience and trust, did not end even at the end. It became the seed of beginnings yet unborn, the promise that in the hush beyond storms, the river always carries life forward, eternal as rain that has not yet fallen, eternal as dawn that waits beyond night. In the silence after silence, when the old universe had folded in on itself and even memory had worn thin, the river stirred. Not in haste, not in thunder, but in the slow, steady rhythm it had always kept. Out of the dark, sparks kindled faint, like embers coaxed back to flame. The current gathered them, not rushing, not boasting,
but carrying them as it had carried seeds through winters, towns through famine, stars through ages. What rose from that hush was no echo of the past, but something new. Worlds began to stir again, quiet as buds pushing through frost. Light seeped back into void, slow and patient. And with that light came life, different from what had been before, but guided by the same unseen compass. They did not remember mankind. They did not remember Hollow Creek, but in their marrow, in their breath, in their dreams, they knew the law that had carried every age before. Storms roar and fade, rivers flow and endure. They sang it in their own tongues, strange and beautiful, though the words bent and twisted in ways no human ear could follow. They carved it into stone, wove it into song, taught it to children who had never seen rain. Yet the rhythm was the same, eternal as gravity, quiet as breath. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. Back in the valley that had once been Hollow Creek, the soil slept under strange constellations. The crooked line of water was gone, yet the ground remembered. Travelers, if any should ever walk there again, would feel it in their bones, not as history, not as legend, but as the hum of the world itself, patience, trust, endurance. Thus the fortune of Hollow Creek, once born from a mule driver halfpenny, became the first song of a new creation, not shouted, not claimed, not owned. It flowed as it always had, unbroken, guiding whatever rose from silence. Storms would come again as they always do. They would roar, tempt, blaze, and they would pass. Rivers would flow again, crooked and steady, and they would endure. The river had no beginning, no end. It was the song that bound the first world to the next, the quiet promise that after every silence, a dawn waits, carried in its current. And so in that new dawn, when the first sparks of life stretched curious hands into the light, the river creed was already waiting. It did not thunder down from heavens nor carve itself into stone. It whispered the way water seeps through soil, the way patience takes root without fanfare. Those earliest folk, strange in form, different from humankind, still felt it in their marrow. When storms of hunger struck, when fire swept their plains, when floods tempted with false plenty, they chose endurance. They chose to save, to trust, to build slow. They did not know they were walking in the footsteps of Hollow Creek. They did not know names like Dusty or Tom. They only knew the whisper that had carried across ages. Storms fade, rivers endure. Their elders taught it not as creed, but as instinct. Do not waste all at once, keep seed for winter. Do not trust noise, but the quiet hand that holds steady. Do not fear storms, they pass. Follow the river, for it flows still. And in every tongue, in every shape, the same law returned. It was not religion, though temples echoed it. It was not science, though scholars mapped it in the stars. It was deeper than both, a compass that belonged to all, older than memory, older than even the worlds they now walked. Civilizations rose from that root. Markets bustled, councils gathered, children sang. Some worlds fell to storms of pride, but those that clung to the river endured, growing strong. Once more the pattern repeated, as it always had, as it always would, and still the river flowed crooked, steady, eternal. Back on Earth, the valley where Hollow Creek once lay buried under forests and time. The creek bed might have dried, might have shifted, but the soil remembered. If ever wanderers of the New Age found it, they would feel the hush soak into their bones. They would wake from dreams speaking words they'd never learned. Don't chase storms, dig rivers, and they would carry them forward, unknowing they had touched the birthplace of their inheritance. Thus the fortune of Hollow Creek, carried across silence into a new cosmos, became the central inheritance of the dawn. Not shouted in boasts, not claimed by kings, but lived in patience, trust, and endurance. The new peoples built their futures as surely as Dusty once scratched numbers into his ledger by lamplight, guided by the same eternal current. Storms had ended the last age, rivers had carried into this one, and so long as rivers flowed crooked and steady, no dawn would ever rise without them. In that newborn cosmos, the first civilizations did more than survive by the river creed. They built their very identities upon it. Where humankind once wavered between storm and stream, these new peoples knew from their first breath that endurance was their marrow. They sang patience in their anthems. They etched trust into their banners. They carved rivers into their temples, not as symbols of water, but of being itself. Councils of the young worlds governed not by flash or fury, but by slow consensus, weighing each voice as carefully as stone on a scale. Their markets moved steady, fair, refusing the bait of quick profit. Families stored food not just for themselves, but for neighbors, knowing that survival was shared. Children grew up hearing the same wisdom in every story. Storms roar and fade, rivers murmur and endure. Artists of the New Age filled their songs and murals with crooked lines of light, saying those bends and turns were the true beauty of creation. Philosophers declared that the river was not only the path to survival but the purpose of existence itself, to flow steady, to nourish, to endure, to shape the world not in haste but in patience. Even warriors, when they marched, moved like rivers, never in reckless rush but in currents that wore down mountains. And yet, for all their wisdom, none of them knew Hollow Creek. None of them knew Dusty bent over his lamp, or Tom running from failure, or Sarah guiding folk through droughts. They did not know the muddy square where children once raised their faces to rain. All of that was dust, but the fortune that had begun there had become their inheritance, unbroken through silence, carried into a dawn they thought their own. Back on Earth, forgotten under forests and stars, the valley still breathed. The creek bed might be shallow now, but when rains came, water still whispered through it. No one marked it, no one prayed there, no one remembered. Yet in the hush between drops, the same words lingered as they always had. Don't chase storms, dig rivers. The land itself remembered, even when all else had passed. Thus the river became not just creed, not just law, but the identity of a reborn cosmos. Civilizations flourished not by chance, not by storm, but by patience and trust. They called it their birthright, though it was far older than them, older than worlds, older than stars. And in that truth lay their strength. Storms would come again. They always did. But these peoples were children of the river, and they would endure as rivers always do. The lantern of quiet fortune. There's an old saying whispered on porches and by the last embers of a campfire, that fortune doesn't come riding in on a stallion loud and fast, but on a mule steady and quiet. This here story is about a man who lived by that truth, though he didn't know it at first. His name was Elias Crow, a wiry fellow with dust always on his boots and a far-off look in his eyes. He'd been raised in a shack outside a town that barely made the maps, where folks survived one lean harvest at a time. His daddy swung a pick at the quarry, his mama kept bread stretching past its nature, and Elias figured early that money was something other folks had, not him. What set him apart, though, was a lantern. Not much to look at, tin-dented, glass-clouded, but it had been his granddaddy, passed down with a whisper that it burned brighter when the mind was steady. Elias didn't put stock in that talk. A lantern was a lantern. But when nights got long, he'd set it by his side, listen to the rain patter on the tin roof, and dream about roads beyond the quarry dust. That little glow gave him ideas, and ideas, when tended, grow into something mighty. He started small. Folks laughed when he began buying scraps of broken tools from miners, handles splintered, heads rusted, hinges bent. That boy collecting junk, they'd jeer. Elias didn't answer. He'd haul him home, sit by that lantern, and mend what he could. Some nights he sanded until his hands blistered. Other nights he hammered until neighbors banged on the walls. Bit by bit, though, a hammer swung true again. A shovel dug clean. A hinge swung straight. By selling them back for less than new, he earned enough coin to buy more scraps. One winter, when the quarry near closed and miners near starved, Elias set up a lean-to and handed out mended tools for near nothing. "Pay me when you can," he'd say, sliding a spade across a rough-hewn counter. Men who'd thought him a fool now saw him as their chance to keep bread on tables. They worked with his tools, dug enough stone to sell, and came back with coins, pressing them into his calloused palms. Elias didn't hoard that silver. He bought stronger metal, sturdier wood, and taught himself to craft tools outright instead of patching. By spring, he wasn't just mending, he was making. Now here, where fortune leaned his way, most blacksmiths in those parts worked loud and fast, iron hissing, sparks flying, sails quick and proud. Elias was different. He studied every piece, thinking on where it failed before. He'd ask miners what broke it. He'd listen, patient as a preacher, then shape his metal to endure that strain. He carved notches where wood needed breathing, thickened edges where stone wore quick, and thinned handles where hands tired fast. His work didn't shine pretty, but it outlasted storms and shifts. Before long, men traveled valleys over just to own a Crow tool. But money, you see, wasn't his first pursuit. It was trust. When a man lantern shone steady, he valued what endured more than what dazzled. Elias saved every extra coin, not for ale or games, but for lumber and iron. He built a workshop with windows wide so light poured in, reminding him of open skies. He hired a boy or two, paying him fair, teaching him patience instead of hurry. In time, he had himself a shop, then a store, then wagons rolling out to towns that once mocked him. The breakthrough came the year floods hit the valley. Crops drowned, roads washed, and bridges fell. Most smiths shut down, supply cut, and wagons stranded. Elias, though, had stocked iron bars in summer, saying to his apprentices, "Storms don't send word before they come." When folks came begging, he opened his doors, handing out tools on credit. "Keep digging, keep building," he'd say, recording names neat in a ledger by lantern light. By autumn, while others counted losses, Elias had earned more loyalty than gold could buy. Men brought back payments honest, even adding extra as thanks. His name spread wider than the flood had, and fortune followed like a shadow. Elias never strutted, never bought himself finery. He kept to his lantern, polishing its glass, sitting quiet each night. When neighbors asked his secret, he'd shrug. I don't chase noise, I mend what broke, I build what lasts. The rest comes of its own accord. Folks began to call him Lantern Crow, saying his light wasn't just in tin and flame, but in the way he lived. Years passed, and Crow Tools became more than a workshop. It was a symbol. Fathers passed shovels to sons, farmers passed hoes to daughters, each stamped with that quiet mark of endurance. Elias grew old, his back bent, his beard white, but his eyes never lost that steady glow. When at last he passed, they say the whole valley gathered. Men set down hammers, women laid aside plows, children held lanterns aloft. They marched in silence through rain to his shop, filling the street with flickering light. They didn't mourn with wails, but with quiet pride, knowing his fortune was now theirs, not in coin, but in craft, patience, and the glow of steady hands. And so the creed of Lantern Crow lived on. Fortune favors the steady, wealth is built in silence, and a true legacy is measured not in gold, but in tools that outlast their maker. To this day, when storms beat roofs and floods wash fields, some old-timer will strike a lantern and whisper, sit steady, build quiet. Crow light never goes out. After Elias Crow passed, the valley felt the hush of his absence. The forge no longer rang with his deliberate strikes. The streets no longer held his wiry frame moving with quiet purpose. But his apprentices, young men and women who had once stood at his side watching his every movement, felt the weight of his lantern resting on their shoulders. They remembered the way he never rushed, the way he asked questions more than he gave orders, and they vowed not to let that steady light flicker out. The eldest apprentice, Thomas Hale, was a broad-shouldered man with a voice like gravel. Where Elias had been wiry and still, Thomas carried a presence that filled a room, yet he had learned restraint from Crow. When the younger smiths clamored to expand fast, to stamp the Crow name on every wagon and hammer in the land, Thomas shook his head. We ain't building a blaze, he said, we're tending coals. A fire steady and quiet lasts longer than sparks that blind. His words settled the others, and they began the slow work of spreading Crow creed beyond the valley. They started by keeping Elias' old promise, repair first, craft second. When towns in the hills brought them broken plows or snapped hinges, the apprentices mended them without boast, charging fair or not at all when times were lean. Word spread like water downstream. Crow folk didn't just sell, they stood beside you, making sure your hands could keep working. By spring, wagons rolled into the valley from places Elias had never seen, bringing not only trade but stories of distant storms and hardships. Each wagon left heavier than it came, laden with tools stamped not only with steel but with trust. But it wasn't tools alone they carried. Each apprentice had taken to wrestling, Elias sayings, not lofty sermons, but simple reminders. Noise fades, steel holds. Don't carve a handle for the hand you see, carve it for the hand yet unborn. Profit runs fast, but trust walks steady. Farmers and traders carried those words home as sure as they carried plows and spades. Soon taverns in far towns echoed with Lantern Crow proverbs, painted on walls or whispered over mugs. The man was gone, but his voice, steady, patient, lingered in every corner where work was done honest. In time, apprentices began setting up shops of their own. One built a forge near the coast where storms salted the air. Another raised a workshop in mountain passes where stone froze tools quick. Each carried the lantern mark above their doors. Each tended to their towns as Elias had once tended his valley. And though the shops grew, they never forgot to pause in silence before the first strike of hammer each day, a moment to steady their minds as Elias had taught. Townsfolk noticed. They said Crow apprentices brought not just iron but calm, a sense that even in chaos there was a way to build quiet, durable fortune. Of course, temptations rose. Rivals in richer towns mocked the slowness of Crow shops, claiming they could turn iron faster, brighter, cheaper. And some apprentices were lured by that glitter, speed in their forges, sacrificing care for profit. But storms came, as storms always do. Tools made in haste snapped, wagons rolled back with angry men demanding refunds. Those who chased sparks saw their names turn to ash, while those who held steady saw their shops glow warmer than ever. Folks remembered a Crow tool might not shine, but it would never fail you when storms hit. Generations turned, and the Crow mark spread far. In distant ports, sailors clutched lantern-stamped knives as charms against the sea. In mountain villages, masons swore by Crow chisels, saying they bit stone true. And in city markets, merchants weighed Crow hinges against cheap imitations, always finding the real ones heavier, steadier, truer. The apprentices became masters, the masters taught new apprentices, and so the line never broke. And through it all, the lantern still burned in the valley shop, kept polished, its glass replaced, its wick trimmed. It remained lit even in the darkest storms. Travelers said you could see it glowing from the ridge on nights when thunder shook the earth, a reminder that patience outlasts noise. They called it the lantern of quiet fortune, and to stand before it was to feel Elias' hand steady in your own, whispering that wealth built slow was wealth that endured. The cities were a different beast than the valley Elias Crow had known. Their streets rang with clanging bells, barked orders, and deals shouted across crowded markets. Guilds ruled there, tight-knit circles of merchants and craftsmen who guarded their trades with iron fists. They didn't take kindly to outsiders, least of all those who preached patience in a world run on speed. When crow apprentices began opening forges near city gates, hanging the lantern mark above their doors, the guildmasters scoffed. Slow work won't last here, they said. City folk want shine, not silence. They'll pay for polish, not patience. At first, it seemed the guilds were right. Shiny tools and flashy trinkets drew crowds, while crow shops sat quiet. The apprentices stayed steady, though, remembering Thomas Hale's words, "We're tending coals, not chasing sparks." They mended what came their way, refusing to rush, refusing to cheapen their craft. Some nights they wondered if they'd made a mistake, watching the guild shops swell with coin. Yet in time the noise began to crack. Hinges bent, blades dulled, wheels splintered. The sparkle that sold quick dulled quicker. Folk, tired of replasting tools every season, began drifting to the lantern-lit shops. There they found axes that stayed sharp through winters, plows that cut clean even in clay, locks that held fast against thieves. The guilds grew restless. Profits thinned, pride bruised, and whispers spread that crow apprentices were undermining the order of the city. Some masters tried to buy them out, offering coin to shut their doors. The apprentices refused. Others tried sabotage, flooding markets with cheap fakes, even sending ruffians to smash lanterns. But no storm lasts forever. Each act of malice only drove folk closer to the lantern mark. A man wronged by a guild shop would find himself welcomed by crow folk who fixed his tools fair, listening with patience as his anger cooled. Slowly the tide shifted. The guild halls still roared with noise, but the quiet shops began to hum steady, like a river cut in stone. As the years rolled, the crow name grew in the city, same as it had in the valley. Apprentices trained city-born lads and lasses, teaching them not just hammer and file, but silence and measure. These new craftsmen carried the creed deeper, planting it in alleyways and markets where noise once reigned. Soon, taverns that had once mocked Lantern Crow now displayed his sayings above their hearths. Noise fades, steel holds. Travelers brought those words home again, until even distant villages spoke them as common as greetings. What truly turned the tide was the Lantern Trust. Formed by a circle of apprentices, it wasn't just a workshop but a way of keeping coin safe. They pooled profits into a common fund, lending fair to families who needed seed or timber, asking only steady repayment when harvest or trade allowed. Unlike the guild banks, which demanded harsh interest and swift return, the Lantern Trust worked with the seasons. At first, city folk called it foolish, but when floods struck and guild banks foreclosed on farms, the trust patience shone. Families saved by its loans never forgot, and they carried lantern marks on their doors in gratitude. The guilds fumed, but they could not crush the quiet fire. Their noise drew crowds still, but Crow Creed drew loyalty. And in time, loyalty proved heavier than glitter. A guild might hold sway for a season, but the Lantern Trust endured for generations, its roots spreading as steady as oak. The city, once deaf to silence, now pulsed with it. By the end of that century, Elias Crow Lantern no longer burned in just one valley shop. It glowed in 100 windows across the land, each light a reminder that true fortune don't come with trumpets or fireworks, but with the slow, steady flame of quiet endurance.